Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fiocca. Today's October 11, 2024. I want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Please subscribe. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with part 2 of Jacob Michael King. Where in the heck you calling in from?
Tulsa, Oklahoma. They call it the Paris of northeastern Oklahoma. They don't, but I call it that.
Part 1 was so fun, Jacob. I appreciate you being. That was May 31 of this year. So the first question I want to delve into is really simple. It's sort of a stupid little pattern I saw where you're going to summarize your life calling in one word, maybe two, after the word the. So like Kubrick was The Shining. James Joyce was The Wake. Lacan is The Real. McLuhan was The Playground. Just off the top of your head, what would Jacob King's be?
I don't know. That's a good question. Man, can we actually save that one for later? The reason I ask is I want to get humming a little bit. You know what I mean? And by the way, you might be skipping a touch. I'm not sure if you hear it on your end, but you're chopping a little bit. So I'm trying to make sure I'm getting you. But yeah, I wanted to hold on that one just because I feel like my brain will be sharper by the end of the interview.
I that went through my head too. Okay, now McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. Knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera or projector extends our eyelid. Maybe even non-tangibles, say religion or philosophy, extends consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? Whether it's a pen or a keyboard, what humanness is extended with the writing utensil?
That's a good question. And one of the things I think is most profound about McLuhan is the fact that he predicted the internet decades before its widespread adoption, right? Where he talked about this, the final extension is the technological extension of consciousness. And this, the electric grid, extends the nervous system, but the technological extension of consciousness itself, we certainly start to see that in something like the Amazon Echo or any of this AI stuff, where the keyboard is going to become a thing of the past, right? We're turning into an oral society again. And we're eventually going to be able to just be talking to our computers and have like a far less, in more ways than one, immediate interface with our technology, with our extensions. For me, it's funny. I've tried a bunch of different ways of writing. I've tried writing longhand. I've tried writing with typewriter. I have several typewriters in my house that are collecting dust. And honestly, for me, the best way to work that I've found, because I have this tendency toward distraction. Like if I'm just at my computer, I'd be reading Wikipedia and watching YouTube and listening to podcasts. I won't get anything done. I'll always have something to distract myself. When I used to drink, I would just drink and drink. This is years ago before I quit drinking, but it's like it would be impossible for me to write by the end of the night because I just had too much to drink, and so like anything to distract me from writing. And so my way of doing it is I tend to sit on my recliner and I'll have a movie on in the background. And so that allows me to have this kind of divided consciousness so that subconscious can come through, and I'm not nearly as likely to pause and watch a YouTube video or do something different if I have a horror movie. If I'm watching Deep Blue Sea or, Friday the 13th Part 2 or something in the background, that I can kind of turn my brain off. And especially like I'm working on a novel right now, a novel is more demanding in some ways than a screenplay, and it can come slower. And so it's like, I can watch a more involved movie. The bummer of that is I watch a ton of movies, but then it's hard to watch a movie with subtitles, for example, when you're working, so they tend to have to be in English or dubbed. So I've watched a lot of Giallo recently, but now they get all snobby about Giallo and they're trying to do it in the original Italian. So even though Giallo actually technically was always dubbed, I don't know if you know that about the genre.
Tell me, I don't know how to spell it and what Giallo is. How do you spell it?
It's Giallo. It's an Italian genre that's sort of a precursor to the slasher movie. I believe it was called Giallo because I believe that's the Italian word for yellow. And these sort of like sleazy trade paperbacks in Italy were always. It's
a film genre, Giallo. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. So That's very interesting what you said about because that's all my wife and I do is watch films now with the subtitles on, because the sound mix in films sucks, and you can really read screenplays. So really what we're doing is reading screenplays. And like we watched Cabaret last night, and that film is so well made. It's a perfect film, and the
Yep.
script is amazing, and it really helps. So I get what you're saying. So what now you're getting to that point. What does the writing utensil extend for you? What humanness?
So sorry, say that again. You broke up a little bit.
What does the writing utensil extend? What humanness does the writing utensil extend? Because
I mean, I guess I guess you would say like my inner monologue, right? Because
your
that's
inner monologue. Yeah.
yeah, and I've read, I don't know if I believe this, but I've read some people say they don't have an inner monologue, and I wonder if they just don't recognize it or if they live entirely by instinct.
Yeah.
But it sounds legitimately insane that you don't think through words. I don't know what that experience would be like.
Well, that's what I asked you that first part. Can humans think without language? You remember what you said? I don't, but it's funny. Can you, just off the top of your head, can humans think without language?
The I don't remember what I said to that. No, did I
Well,
mention Rousseau?
What do you say now? I'm just saying off the top of your head, what would you say now?
I mean, what? So I wrote an essay on my website about Rousseau.
Yeah.
And he has this. It's interesting because Rousseau, even though he pretends to be a Christian or whatever, he has this like he really leans towards secularism in a lot of ways. At least in the couple of texts I've read from him. I'm by no means an expert on Rousseau,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because he has this he has this idea of sort of like it can be mischaracterized, but it's a kind of Edenic past before civilization, and he says there's this one problem that I can't quite figure out. Right. And it's been a long time since I wrote this essay. So I'm probably far more precise in the essay than I am, elsewhere. But he basically has this idea that, well, one thing I can't figure out is how did humans first happen upon abstraction? Because the first thing that we really need to build a civilization is language. But in order to build a language, we have to understand abstraction, right? We have to, because everything we see would be a new word and a new phenomenon, until like every tree we saw would have a different word, until we were able to categorize, right? Until we were able to understand the form of tree or the form of man and woman and grass or whatever, right? Like every single thing would be a different thing, would be basically a proper name. But there's this movement that has to happen where we have to kind of intuit or recognize, I'm a Christian, but my metaphysics tends to lean toward Platonism, right? Like I think Christianity is the only system that I know of that have answered the questions that Plato asked, at least for me. This idea of the forms being there before we are, the forms preceding us, that the material rests upon the spiritual, not the other way around. That superstructure precedes base, to invert Marx. And so Rousseau is asking this question, like, I don't understand, because in order to have a civilization, we have to have language. And for all the people around to actually agree upon a set of categories and words, etc. In order to do that, you'd have to have abstraction. Now, a civilization itself can maintain this concept of abstraction and explain it to people and say, these are the words we use for this thing, etc. But how do two individuals start agreeing on the same abstractions, much less a whole group, a whole tribe of them? Right. And so to me, Rousseau actually runs into a puzzle that confuses his own system and disproves it. Because to me, again, it's like in the beginning was the Logos, as the Gospel of John says. The Logos predates both civilization and man. And that's how we can act. Like it's not something that we invent or create, this Logos, this abstraction. It's something that we discover. Like fire. Fire is there long before us. And if that's true, then we're talking about a divine origin and not a natural one.
Okay, hold it, Jacob. I want to insert really quick. Is that comparable to Chomsky saying we're hardwired for language, and other people say, no, we invented language? Is that similar to what you just said?
I think it is. Now Chomsky, as far as I know, is a very secular thinker, and he's turned into a rather whiny one. Even though I do admire a lot of what he's said in the past, and disagree with other things, but I think he's a valuable thinker. Yeah, sort of. Except for I think that there's something divine to it. I don't think it's merely. I don't. I mean, are you familiar with this Platonic idea of forms?
Well, no, what's the it there? So I'm trying to say, is language in us innately or not? Did we invent it? What's your take on that? And then tell me the Platonic form thing.
Okay, so and by the way, you're still breaking up a bit.
Okay.
This may just be on my end. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's on your end as far as I can tell. But whenever you need me to repeat, just say repeat.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Okay, so it's not just that it's hardwired into us; it's like hardwired into the cosmos. Do you understand? So for example, every material phenomenon actually is guided in physics by laws. Do you understand? Like this process of induction, right? We see,
Yeah.
like, I can drop this, pack of Zin 1,000 times, and then I can
Yeah.
intuit by my test that there's this law, this immaterial law that actually guides it, called gravity, right? And so that immaterial thing, that's an idea. That because an idea isn't just something in my head. It's something much more powerful and more abstract that conditions the material world, right? This
Yeah.
conditioning is outside of us. It's and so we're conditioned by it. We don't rule it. And there's this modern idea or this modern sort of turn where we think this is all in our head, or it's something that derives from our culture, etc. And I would argue, and I think Rousseau almost gets there, and then he backs away. I would argue that this sort of idea and stuff like language is actually a cosmic law. It's said. Like there's this idea in Hinduism, and I'm not an expert on Hinduism, but I remember reading this idea that the Vedas were like sung from the dawn of the cosmos.
Yeah.
In Christianity, which is my faith, the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And that Logos came and dwelled among us in the form of as Christ, right? Like the Logos took on flesh. But that Logos, that word, in Greek, it means word, but it can also mean law. And so there's this, the idea that God spoke, and then there was light, and then there was the cosmos. Then there was the earth and the water, et cetera, and living things. That the word precedes material. This divine word, right? And so that's sort of, so it's not just hardwired into us; it's hardwired into everything that is.
And
That
so
in order to be,
does that explain Platonic form? You were going to say, what does Platonic form mean?
yeah, it edges right up to it, right? They're
Yeah.
sort of two sides of the same coin. To be is to be conditioned, right? Except for, so that's why there's a theologian. I don't know if I mentioned this last time. Please, I'm like a grandpa where I'll tell the same story 20 times. So please stop me if I'm telling the same story. There's this theologian named Pseudo-Dionysius that says it's not correct to even conceive of God as existing, not because God doesn't exist, but because God is the author of being itself, the very condition of being, right? God is outside of, because God isn't even conditioned by that. He's that which conditions it. So I hope that makes sense. But so like the Platonic,
yeah.
so the Platonic form. So for example, we have something like a tree. And now there are individual instances of a tree, but there are things. There's an abstract concept of a tree that no individual thing actually completely coheres to, right? Like a sycamore and a pine tree are radically different, but the two things are both under this category of tree, and the tree itself actually is divine. Like this concept, this abstract concept of what a tree is immortal and divine, and it exists in the realm of forms. And then every temporary mortal instantiation of that just coheres in some way or another to this concept of tree. And so there's the formal and the material there's this inseparable gulf between them. But in Christianity, that gulf is bridged by the Logos becoming flesh. But in Platonism, the idea is that when we contemplate the forms, we're contemplating something much higher than any individual instantiation, right? When we contemplate the beauty of a person, we eventually start to understand what beauty itself is and where it comes from, which is ultimately God, right? Not just this individual being.
Really good, Jacob. You're really articulate and concise, and I appreciate it. A
Oh,
couple things you evoked there. One was early on. It's almost like I repeat this Lily Tomlin quote often. Reality is just a collective hunch. We kind of collectively agree what words mean, like when you say the word tree. So I like that you sussed that out, the Platonic. And also earlier when you were talking Rousseau, it immediately reminded me of two things in just the act of writing. D.H. Lawrence wrote Women in Love on, pads of paper, put all the pads of paper aside, and then rewrote it without referring to the notes. So it was sort of like he had to consume in his very muscle memory, or whatever you want to call it, exactly what he wanted to write. Now, how much difference is it from his original writing? I'm not sure, but it is an interesting idea, and it resonates with Hunter Thompson. Sat down early in his writing career and just typed out The Great Gatsby. So he wasn't trying, he was trying to just learn the form of how a great writer wrote by duplicating it exactly. So now to the next question is, what do movies extend? What humanness do movies extend? Because you said the writing utensil extends the inner monologue. That's a really good answer for what does a pen extend? What do movies extend?
So, well, okay, a couple things. First of all, what Thompson did with The Great Gatsby, I really relate to, because there's
Yeah,
this. When I was young, the movie I was obsessed with the most was Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia,
yeah.
and it's interesting because that movie has like a sort of unique place in my mind. I wouldn't say it's my favorite movie now or anything, but it's something that I have a great deal of sentimental attachment to. And there was a point when I was writing scripts when I was a lot younger, where there's like everything I did, it was just aping Magnolia essentially. And I almost like there was a point at which I thought, like, why don't I just write Magnolia? Like, why don't I just sit down and write it? Because I know the movie and I'm like so obsessed with it and I can't think outside of it at that moment. And I'm probably misinterpreting this because it's been ages since I've read Bloom. But have you heard Bloom's idea of the anxiety of influence?
I know one interpretation, but tell me what yours is.
Tell me if ours is similar. As far as I know, like his idea of like how a great poet is formed is they get obsessed with one poet, right? There's one poet that haunts them, and they
Yeah.
actually misread them, right? They actually read them in a way that sort of like mirrors their own concerns and their own subconscious, and the process of becoming a great artist is actually like breaking free of that misinterpretation and realizing that it's sort of like their own voice. And to me, like my anxiety of influence really was Magnolia in a lot of ways, where it's like it took me a long time to actually understand, like this is when I was probably 14, or something, but
Yeah.
it took me a long time to sort of say, hey, this is not the only thing that cinema is, right? Like like now I can see someone like William Friedkin and admire him immensely, but I wouldn't get that at first, right? It's like when I first really got into music, I was listening to like indie music. So it's like Modest Mouse and Arcade Fire were the perfect example of music. And I didn't understand how a band like, I don't know, MC5 or the Stooges were superior to them and how they had all these influences. Right.
That's a great comment. But you're still making a value judgment. I mean, I agree with you.
Wait, it's I mean,
Iggy, but Iggy's the Stooges are so bad. How could they be better than anybody? But that's what they are, is unique. But again, someone might say, "Oh, I think the other bands you mentioned are better than those." So that's making a value judgment based on your exposure to the history of music. So I love what you said. Let me go back, Jacob, for a second before.
Yeah.
we
Oh,
go.
can I just, as a quick footnote, I do want to say that I mean, I love Arcade Fire and Modest Mouse. I think Neon Bible is one of the most underrated
Yeah.
albums. Like, people call it a sophomore slump, and I think
Yeah.
it's a towering masterpiece. I agree with Robert Christgau. I believe he gave it an A plus, and it deserves.
Yeah, there you
The
go.
Neon Bible is one of the great albums, and it's like,
Yeah. And they're respected pattern recognizers in the history of rock and roll music. So
which is
you
almost all rock is pattern recognition, you know. So
yeah, but I mean that's all value judgment on anything. You know, why is Harold Bloom better than Bloomsday events? But
yeah,
here's the thing. I want it so it doesn't go too far. First of all, when I saw Magnolia, and I know that Tom Cruise's character is kind of being Harold Roberts. What's his name? You know, it's based
Frank
on.
C.J. Mackey.
I know, but who it's based on this self-help guy who started in Venice. I can't think of his name, but anyways, he's huge self-help guy. He has millions of people.
You mean Tony Robbins?
Tony Robbins started on the Venice boardwalk as a fat kid, right here in Venice. Okay, he learned NLP. He knows how to teach persuasion, whatever. But Tom Cruise's character is sort of like that. When I saw Magnolia, I said, when I give workshops to art and film students, that's what my workshops are like. What Tom Cruise is doing. Now I know that's like ego bullshit, but it is funny. I go, that's what I do. And they're like, you're not supposed to teach kids that way. Anyways, that's the funny part. The other thing you said was the exercise that you thought might have been good was not to buy the screenplay, but to write it out from your memory, how you absorbed it.
Yeah.
So you taught me a big thing about anxiety of influence, which I'll go into in a second. But here's the key line. We shape our buildings, then they shape us. That's Winston Churchill. Marshall McLuhan took the aphorism and changed it. So this is the whole point that he taught me about aphorisms is how do you reinterpret it, or your word, misread it, or reinvent it, however you want to put the verb there. He said, we shape our tools, then they shape us. So it's a good way to summarize McLuhan. We shape language, then it shapes us. But on the album, the medium is the message, which John Simon or whatever his first name is, I think it's John Simon, produced. He produced Janis Joplin records. He produced important music. He produced an album with Marshall McLuhan. And in that album, most people don't know, a parrot goes, we shape our tools, then they ape us. Ape.
Yeah.
This, like, he changes the word again to ape, or we ape our tools. I could be getting it backwards. It could be we ape our tools, then they shape us. But he changes that shape to ape, which is mimicking. So the last part I wanted to insert here, and thank you for your patience, is I learned, I didn't read Harold Bloom's Anxiety Influence. I just used one stock line. You absorb your influence, then you abandon them. And what you taught me is no, you absorb them, and then you kind of do a McLuhan thing. The user is the content. You get out of your influence what you want. And then the point is, how do you abandon that so you don't become a clone or a wannabe?
So it's interesting because I like, to be fair, I think I only read half of Anxiety of Influence when I was like 20, so I didn't understand the references, you know, like, and I was looking for the paperback a while back and couldn't find it. Maybe I'll be able to find it at some point.
But it's important, Jacob, that even if you got that wrong, you've added a new chunk to my learning by saying, no, it's how you misread it. I'll give you a perfect example. I'm a guitarist. I love to play funk guitar. The greatest funk guitar song of all times is Sissy Strut by the Meters. I couldn't play it properly for 10 years, and everybody can play it. It's a bar band national anthem for years. And I could only play it the way I kind of misplayed it. So I eventually kind of learned how to play
Yeah.
it, but I always loved that I wasn't playing it right because I was it actually reminds me of Jean Cocteau. He said, take your first piece of art, your first book, your first poem, your first painting, in your peer group, your parents, your teacher, your critics say to you, dude, you did something good, but this is what you got wrong, or here's where you have to improve. Take that criticism and exploit it the rest of your career.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of like how to assimilate
Yeah,
influence.
assimilate. That's the word.
And it's uh so I've been obsessed. And I don't know, like I haven't been able to talk to anyone else about him. But Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula,
Yeah.
I so I'm a horror writer. I don't know if you've seen my film Caviar, but it's a horror movie. I'm working on, I wrote a screenplay that's shooting this month. It's more of an action movie, though it has some horror elements. But I mean, fundamentally, like horror is my genre.
Yeah.
And Dracula was never my favorite horror book at all. I think Frankenstein's a superior book to Dracula, just in terms of craft.
Yeah.
Like Frankenstein's so beautifully written, and Dracula is great in a lot of it, but it's messy and but for whatever reason, I kept being drawn to Stoker. And in the last few months, he wrote 12 novels, and I'm on my 8th of his 12 novels at this point. I've never been this taken by a writer. And it's not necessarily because he's great, but because it's like I almost feel there's something I think the term is like sui generis about him.
How do you spell that?
It's Latin. It's like SUI space GENERIS. Like
sui generis. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, like he reminds me a little bit of M. Night Shyamalan in that I think that almost everything he does is misinterpreted. I think it's Cahiers du Cinema who wrote that after Lady in the Water. They listed Lady in the Water as one of the best films of the year, and they're like, everybody misinterpreted this. Like, it's clearly not meant to be realistic. They are. It's basically like they don't give the guy the benefit of the doubt. They just assume that he's an idiot for the choices that he makes, when instead he's actually doing something smart and clever and daring and different. And about Stoker, what I find interesting is this guy had this one, colossal hit and never really had any other thing nearly as big. He wrote a mummy book that was very influential, but not nearly as much as Dracula, called Jewel of the Seven Stars, which is a very good book. But it's funny because it's like, I don't understand why I'm so drawn to him right now. Like, maybe I feel like he's some kind of brother in arms in a sense, but like everything I read by him is so bonkers. And like Dracula is very much like, if you read Dracula, it's exactly what you expect. It's effective. You know what it is, but his other books are so strange. And like an example is Mystery of the Sea, is this beautiful book he wrote that I would recommend to anybody. So you start it, and it's this sort of like weird supernatural elements are all over the place, and then suddenly it turns into an adventure novel and a romance novel about like pirates and cryptography and the Spanish Armada and buried treasure, and it weaves all of these elements together in a way that's absolutely dazzling. And I was reading it, like I read it close on the heels of that. I read a book that's considered to be in the same genre by a guy named Wilkie Collins, who was a protege of Dickens. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote this book called The Woman in White, which is a really celebrated sort of proto thriller, and it's a great book. But I think Stoker is more impressive in the same genre, where he it is a book that absolutely defies categorization, and its pacing is breakneck. And it reads like the best of someone like Dean Koontz. I think Dean Koontz is a very underrated writer, and at times I think his prose can be genuinely impressive. And Stoker is the same way. And it's interesting because I guess there's something about him that haunts me, where I find like he's wrestling with all of these issues in Victorian England, and at times he has really thoughtful takes on them, and he does things in his books that feel so new, like even today, and yet he's someone that's been almost entirely forgotten, except for Dracula. Like, it's really hard to find his books in print in general, and there's something really weird to me about that, where, you know, I guess there's this idea that you're supposed to, if you you know, like if you write something truly great, then it'll be remembered forever. And I think like The Mystery of the Sea is truly great, and yet it's barely mentioned, except for among the 5 Stoker scholars that exist. You know, and I wonder why. Like, I wonder how someone can be so capable. And yeah, it's not as powerful as Dracula. And I think Dracula is probably the most powerful thing he's ever written, but I think it's better in terms of craft, right? Like, I think a lot of his books are better in terms of craft. And I just wonder, I don't know, it's like, it's a question that's been haunting me. I mean, he's like, I can't even think about other writers right now, almost fiction, right? Because we're trying to read all this fiction to work on this novel. And I'm reading this other book and I'm just bored with it. And I just want to read more Bram Stoker, and I'm almost out of Bram Stoker. So I don't know what to do. Right. Like all the other ones are like his totally forgotten books. And I don't know what I'm going to do, because it's like, I probably got duds the rest of the way. I'm like reading the last one probably that's any good. Maybe I'm wrong,
but there has been several Dracula movies,
yeah,
whether they're good or bad, blah, blah, blah. Back to the movie. What does the movie extend? What human?
I'm so sorry for that detour. I'm like
No,
I'm like a crazy.
Don't be sorry, Jacob. Don't be sorry. I encourage detours, tangents, anecdotes, stories. Please, I welcome them. I welcome any detour. So, but just back.
Yeah.
What does the movie extend? What humanness?
So it's interesting, because like when you say that, immediately I think of Marshall McLuhan's idea that like every medium cannibalizes the old one. Yeah. You know, and so the movie extends or cannibalizes theater is what he said. And television cannibalizes cinema. But it seems like the movie would extend our visual sense naturally.
That's what most people say. It extends the eye or memory. You know what Marshall said, which is funny? The movies extend our foot because we're traveling.
That's interesting.
like on a magic carpet ride. But let's go on, because all this will
also our sense of time, right? Because like Tarkovsky
is huge.
Right, like Tarkovsky talked about cinema being unique in the way that it can extend our sense of time, which I actually disagree with. I think a novel can do that. I think a symphony can do that. You know, but I do think it does it in a unique way, and it also it assimilates all media before it, just like television does, and just like that's why I think, you know, VR, even if we don't necessarily have headsets in the future, like VR will be is a precursor of what's to come, where again it's like things are less mediated by devices that are so present, like a television or a computer screen. Like I think they're going to be a lot more intimate in the future, and they're going to feel.
Dolly had a great thing. He said, you show a movie of fur and you put your hands on this fur and it rolls around. So you feel the fur and you're watching the movie. So he was inventing VR in a way, sort of analog VR. But the other thing, bringing up Tarkovsky, I appreciate that, because his book is called Sculpting in Time. And Chris Marker, one of his great peers, who made one of the great documentaries on Tarkovsky, Chris Marker said, can you escape time? If you haven't watched Sans Soleil, you've got to watch it and read the script. It is an amazing advancement in what movies can do and what movies are, you know. So that's the cool thing, is you can actually read Sans Soleil before you even watch it if you want. Now,
wait, can I ask really quickly, what is your favorite Tarkovsky movie?
Oh, I'm not well versed in Tarkovsky. I mean, I don't know him that well. I mean, I just know he's important, and I probably would rather have his book on my shelf than I think I probably have Solaris on a Criterion DVD on my shelf, and I've watched the extras once. I don't know. I mean, no, I've watched Ivan's Childhood.
That's the one I haven't seen. Is it any good?
Dude, I'm not well versed in Tarkovsky. I know he's important, and it's time management. Like I rather watch somebody like you doing a 10-minute tutorial on Tarkovsky than watching his film. Unless I'm in the right mood and I'm in an art museum or I'm in a big theater and I'm going to watch them correctly. I can't, you don't give movies the chance if you watch them like I do on a little screen now. I did 10 years of curating in a big movie theater, experimental and art films and mainstream films. So I know what that experience is. I'll give you a good example. Every time in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the mid 70s, every time I showed Enter the Dragon, we had a complete sold out house.
Mm.
I didn't know what was the attraction. So
Really?
I knew what it was, but I didn't know it because I had never experienced it. I said, I've got to go sit in the middle of my audience and watch the entire film and get the experience. And I realized it was ballet.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable how I had to learn how to experience that. All the power to me. I got the experience of Bruce Lee. Now, here's the question, Jacob. A screenwriting teacher told me great art or great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're making or writing a film?
To me, it's borderline insane that Kubrick would say that. Um, uh, it would be sort of like Saddam Hussein saying, like, I believe that I'm a libertarian. I believe in freedom for all people, right? Like,
Jacob, drop who I said say that.
Right, the reason I
know
mentioned
what you're saying because I took it out of context, so he could have said a lot more there. But I know what you're saying. It's borderline. We know what he's saying in this line extracted out of some other paragraph of
right.
him talking. So go ahead. Any comments on that? What
Well,
role? Yeah.
I mean, to me, like one of the many reasons Kubrick is one of my favorite directors is because he's so stylistically distinct. Like even now, right? Like people can imitate Kubrick all they like. They'll never. Parajanov, the Armenian director who did the beautiful film Color of Pomegranate, said, "He who imitates me is lost." And I feel that way about
he imitates what? I missed that. He
said, "He
what?
who imitates me is lost." And I feel that way about a lot of the really great stylists. I think the same thing could be said of Tarantino. It's interesting, actually. I've begun to admire Guy Ritchie a lot. I used to think of him as just an imitator of Tarantino, but I seriously watched Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels in the last couple months, and I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's one of the best movies of the '90s, and I think it's really unfortunate that it like got caught up in that wave because I feel like it's its own thing, right? It's not Pulp Fiction. It's this beautiful. It's its own thing. But I think to me, like part of what's so fun about art is this kind of to see what someone can do stylistically and someone sort of like inviting you into their creative vision in a way that changes how you look at the rest of the world. And like if you see a great movie or read a great book for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week, you're abuzz thinking about it, and it colors and textures. I mean, the effect is almost narcotic, and so to me, I love that idea of the intent of the artist. It's interesting to bring it back to Tarkovsky. He's someone I wrestled with for a long time because like when I was in high school, he was one of my favorite directors, like post P.T. Anderson, like when I really started to watch, and I love P.T. Anderson still. I think he's amazing. I think he's one of the best people working. But like when I really started to get into like, cinema capital C, like the weird stuff on Criterion, I was really into Tarkovsky. And then as I got older, I started to hate Tarkovsky because I saw this documentary called Voyage in Time. And this could just be my misreading of it, right? But there's this documentary about Tarkovsky where they ask him questions like, Andre, what is art? And he'll like look into the distance and give these weird koan answers that are ridiculous. And the entire time, the entire movie, as I recall, he's wearing these tiny shorts and you can see his penis in the entire documentary. And it's like and there are these like wide shots of his penis just like staring at you. And you're like, why are you doing it? Like, it's a bizarre, like, and maybe it's just because he's Russian and he's in Europe and this is what people did. But I'm like, he's like literally like laying his phallus on our forehead to try and like impose this vision. And it felt like, you know, at a movie like Mirror, I think I found incredibly pretentious. Maybe I would feel differently now, but I felt like he was like this weird narcissist who was humorless. And then recently I've really started to appreciate him again. I started to see the humor. I started to see like a lot of the depth that, like, initially the depth I thought was that his movies were so slow and they were so beautiful and they sort of changed the way you saw the intent thing, right? There was a lot of intent behind it. But at the same time, I felt like, to me, Speed is every bit as impressive as Solaris, right? Speed is an incredibly impressive movie, and you know, if someone Armageddon, right? Like, I think Armageddon is one of the top 3 films probably of the '90s, and people don't really understand its greatness, right? And I think Armageddon is every bit as thematically rich as The Seventh Seal or Solaris or I don't know, Citizen Kane, right? Like, Armageddon is just misunderstood because people are snobs. But you know, the proof's in the pudding, and its box office is, you know, Terminator, incredibly impressive piece of work, right? And so, but you know, recently going back to Tarkovsky, you know, I saw nostalgia again recently in Solaris, and I was really struck by the fact that they weren't humorless, the fact that there was a lot of ambiguity, the fact that it wasn't just slow for slow's sake and beauty for beauty's sake. I mean, I think there's a lot of richness there, and so he's someone that I've wrestled with a lot as a stylist. And so that to bring it back to that question of intent, I really love being invited into a vision. I tried to make my movie. Did you see Caviar? Have you seen my movie?
I haven't seen it. Invite into a vision.
I want to invite. You did see what?
I should see it. I'm sorry. I haven't. Yeah.
No problem. You can see it for free on Tubi, or you can buy it on Amazon if you ever feel so inclined.
But Jacob, let me ask you, because I want to go back for a second and then continue on. He who imitates me is lost. Spell the last name of that person who said that.
His name is Parajna, Parajanov. He was an Armenian director who, I believe,
Color of Pomegranates.
Yeah, have you seen that?
No, but I know. I just want to make sure I got his name down there. Now, the funny thing is, you the way you were talking almost reminded me of somebody like Fassbinder and Pasolini, all these guys who I know they're great, and I've never spent the time or had the effort to really go in to study him. Herzog and Wim Wenders I know about, but Fassbinder's supposedly better. So it's amazing how you tackled that intention question, and I want you to continue on, but I wanted to address what he who imitates me is lost, in reference to Frank Zappa said, a genius is someone who steals and you can't tell who they stole from. So, you know, it's funny because we know, having studied Zappa for 60 years, he stole from Spike Jones, Johnny Guitar Watson, and Edgar Varese, but he kind of reinvented it. So, you know, you're innovating, you invite someone into your vision, and maybe your vision is a new kind of vision, looking farther. The other person he's talking about in saying he who imitates me is lost is T.S. Eliot. He kind of made the original statement. He says, the mature poet steals, the immature poet imitates. And my friend says, well, I must be an immature poet. So again, we don't want to propagate that word stealing. You know, to me, the Coen brothers are Preston Sturges wannabes. I know they're good, but to me, if I said that to them, they might go, thanks for the compliment.
Right. I love the Coen brothers. Like, to me, one of the greatest things about the Coen brothers, I would say, the biggest compliment I could give is that I can't pick a favorite Coen brothers movie. Yeah. But can I actually? I want to ask you a question. Like, have you ever heard this idea that, I can't remember who said this. It might have been like John Milius or someone he worked with, but he said something like, it probably wasn't even him. I don't know. I'm having a senior moment, but basically, like, a movie is good if you can watch it with the sound off. And I think
that's maybe a great statement.
Yeah, so maybe my favorite movie of the century so far has, as far as I know, experienced no retrospectives Nobody, like, it's like 20% on Rotten Tomatoes. Nobody understood it. It seems when it came out. I've heard a few people speak well of it, but it's a film called Suspect Zero with Aaron Eckhart and Carrie-Anne Moss and Ben Kingsley. And it's directed by a guy named E. Elias Marriage, who directed Shadow of the Vampire with John Malkovich, and then this very strange art film called Begotten that you can get like on YouTube. And that's all he ever did. As far as I know, he might be working on something new. He does like a lot of art stuff. He did a bunch of Marilyn Manson music videos and stuff, but in general, like those are his 3 features. But Suspect Zero, I just watched it again with a friend of mine, and going through it, maybe more than almost any movie I've ever seen. The plot is complicated in some ways, but I feel that you could genuinely understand everything, virtually every major plot point in that film with the sound off. Yeah. And I didn't notice it until the last time I saw it. And speaking of a vision, like that, another amazing thing about that movie, because most people said that it was just a standard serial killer movie, but it's actually, what one critic I saw said, this is not it. What it is it's in dialogue with other serial killer movies. It's like it's a reimagining and then also like a reinterpretation of every trope in the genre in a way that it's not even a thriller. It's actually like this incredibly heartbreaking story of this relationship between like a killer and an FBI agent, and it sort of it reimagines how, you know, like in every TV serial killer show episode, it's like, oh, the killer is after this one agent and he's, you know, sending him evidence and you know, like he has this fixation on an agent, and that's in the movie, but it's not it's done in a truly unique and tragic way. It's like it's nodding to that trope and then it's reinventing it. But that's
a good point. How do you acknowledge a trope? And this is what alchemy is. I probably said this before, but alchemy is taking 2 things that are known, put them together, and kind of invent a third new unknown thing. And what Preston Sturges and Zappa both did was they were alchemists. You know, Preston kind of invented screwball comedy. Frank kind of invented theatrical rock. Then they satirized their new invention. Not that they were literally out to invent something new. They were just making their art, and then they satirized their own art. Because Preston kind of invented the director is the writer. They're both one and the same. So here's the next question, and I love you brought up John Milius, because there is a documentary on John Milius which I saw, and it really nails his importance in that big hierarchy of cinema makers in Hollywood. George Lucas and Spielberg and Coppola, and Milius is up there, but he's sort of pushed off to the side because he's a whatever. The doc on him really susses.
We all know why he was pushed off to the side. Let's be honest.
Okay, I
know. And I think I think for a group of people that are supposed to be so open-minded and tolerant, I think it's ridiculous that that an artist that great. I mean,
I understand. I'm glad you know more than me, and I believe you.
Jacob, but you know why he was pushed to the side too. You just didn't say it, right?
No, I don't. Tell me.
Because he was a conservative.
Right. Okay, that's it. Yeah, you're right.
True or false, right? Like it seems.
I would say you're probably right. Yeah. Okay, and now I'm looking at Big Wednesday on my shelf. I dumpster dove a DVD, and I'm intending to watch it soon because I know it's one of the greatest surf films ever made. And anyways, here's the other doc I was wondering if you saw, was the doc on Brian De Palma.
Is it called De Palma?
I'm not sure, but both of those guys are articulate and talking about their art form. And that's what, whether you like or dislike De Palma, he's very articulate. Yeah. And I love that it doesn't matter if John Milius said it or not. Movie is good if you can watch it with the sound up. Okay, let's go to the next.
I have a question, just really quick. Have you ever seen De Palma's movie Passion? I think it's one of his most underrated movies.
Say the word title again.
Passion. It's got Rachel McAdams in it. It came out in like 2012. Yeah. It's his second to last movie. I just watch it and tell me what you think if you haven't seen it. I think it's one of the most interesting treatments of women he's ever done.
Yeah.
Up there with Carrie, maybe more so. It's about women being evil to each other, and it's amazing. It's like it's one of those movies that I think, like Femme Fatale or like I can name a lot of them, but I think a lot of times Brian De Palma has been sort of, some of his stuff is celebrated, and then other stuff is just sort of dismissed. And I think this one was unfairly.
Yeah, and believe me, we can go on and on about individual filmmakers, and I appreciate your articulate knowledge a lot more than me. I just tend to, just so you know, I've showed films from 72 to 80 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Marty, Mean Streets, Woody, Robert Altman, Coppola, Sam Peckinpah. From that point on, I can't watch and don't want to watch anything that has blood or guns or knives in it. I just said, I don't need that in my life. So I know that that's my limitation, but that's just the way I am. So it's hard for me to even consider watching any film that has any of that in it. And in Cabaret last night had blood in it, and I was like, ick, but it was like so fast that I went, okay, I allowed it. And it was
okay. So I'll warn you, there is some blood in Caviar, but I think you will like it. And it's not a work of realism, right? Yeah. I'm kidding through a lot of this, and I'm trying to point out some I would be very curious to hear what you think, just because I made it for people like you with sophisticated taste and with that are interested in provocation, and Caviar.
Yeah, I don't know if I have sophisticated taste, but I know how to talk about films. So here's the next question, Jacob. Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much do you think of your viewer when you're making your film, or your reader when you're writing your essay or novel?
A lot. And it's it depends, right? Like in a way, it's interesting because the best work I've ever done, for my money at least, is this novel called David the Sinner, which I am still trying to get published. I'm hoping, because my resume is a bit better now, that, I got actually a really nice rejection letter recently where they're like, we really admire this book. We thought it was really good, but it's just not commercial. Like, it's so experimental. It's so strange. Essentially, like we have to make money as a small press. A lot of small presses are nonprofit, so you should send it to them. And people wouldn't even ask me for a partial when I first sent it out, because I just had some stories published, and so now it's like my resume is better, and I think this book can get published. But the reason I mentioned that book is I wrote it, the audience was me, in the sense that I thought, like, I just want to write the best book I can. I just want to write the most innovative, interesting, powerful story that I can. And I felt like if anyone had my taste, they would form that audience. And I still do that, right? But like the book I'm writing right now, I'm actually trying to make it more commercial, in the sense that I remember hearing this from Stephen King, and it sort of blew my mind, actually, that he'd written Pet Sematary and he put it away in a drawer. And Pet Sematary may be his most powerful book. And he said he put it in a drawer because he didn't think anyone would want to read it. And that never occurred to me. But what's interesting, especially working on the script, like the director I was working with has such good instincts about, like, an audience will like this and they won't. And he also, like, he wrestles with, I don't want to speak for him, but I hear him wrestling with, like, what the audience likes versus what I like. And he has sort of he has a different attitude toward audiences than I do. But like in my mind, at least, like, if I write the greatest novel in the world and nobody reads it, I will have considered my time wasted. I could have gone and spent time helping people, etc. Like, I write because I want to be in dialogue with an audience. And so in that sense, I think a lot about my audience. Now the question, I haven't had a hit yet. Hopefully this movie will do well, God willing, but like I haven't had a hit yet. So I can't say that I'm Hitchcock or Spielberg in that sense, but I definitely want to have, I want to have a viewership. And even Caviar, it's interesting because, like, it got, some critics, like Film Threat was very kind to it, or AIPT had, gave us a really good review. But on Letterboxd, which is this sort of like Facebook for movies, people were furious. And I think it's because of the politics, because they saw me as like right wing, and it's an anti-war film. It's not a right wing or left wing movie. But it's interesting because it's like, at least I was in dialogue, whereas some people would say, like, this is a great, crazy, low budget, bonkers horror movie. And then other people would say, like, this is some insane screed by a conspiracy theorist. And it's like, at least I'm at least I made something that people watched.
Two things. Really fast, Jacob.
Oh, go ahead.
Warhol said, don't worry about what people think of your art, just keep making it, which I find inspiring. And also, if half the people love it and half the people hate it, you did something right. Because if everybody loves it and everybody hates it, you probably fucked up.
I think you've got a really good point. Except, but like, it's not that I don't worry about what people think about my art, but actually, I think one of the best quotes I've ever heard about art comes from Ezra Pound, and he said, it was something like, never listen to the advice of someone who has not produced admirable work themselves. And I think that's a much better barometer. Because if someone is good at what they do and they don't like it, and you can see why, then I think I think you have a reason to worry about it. Now, if someone, there's this funny clip of Billy Corgan, like in the I think when he was doing solo stuff, like post Pumpkins, early 2000s, and he's playing a concert and there's this heckler. And he's like, why don't you come up on stage and tell me what you think? And the guy is like, why did you make Mocking of the Machines of God? That sucked, or whatever. Like he's like, I love Siamese Dream and this and that, but your later stuff sucks. And Billy Corgan goes, I really like that song you wrote, and I think he's got a really good point, because it's like, this guy didn't write any songs. This guy's just, armchair critic. But if I don't know, if someone like Isaac Brock from Modest Mouse or George Clinton or someone said, hey, I don't like your new stuff, Billy Corgan, then that I think would mean, and I like a lot of Billy Corgan stuff. I think, so I'm not at all like, I'm a huge fan. He's a formative influence for me. But if like some great artist.
Well, that's funny. You said George Clinton, because I always quote, I did the longest interview with George Clinton ever. And then 20 years later, I talked to him at his book signing party, and he actually answered a question in the Q&A that said, what kind of music do you like? And he goes, I like the kind of music that pisses me off, so I can figure out why it pisses me off, which is, I'm in this genre of music. Why would music ever piss you off? Like, why would this kid, Billy's fan, heckler, he's in the world of consuming music and he likes some, and then he's critical of other Billy. That's fine. That's being a critical thinker. He should embrace that. It's just that we so much want to say this is good and this sucks, when it's really the environment that you create around experience the art, because one day you might like it and the next day you might not like it. You might be able to keep on putting on the music that you grew up with, that hit you when you were a kid, and that still speaks to you. You might not. It might be dated. So here's the next question. Two of my film heroes say, ignore yourself. George Manupelli started the Ann Arbor Film Festival over 60 years ago, and Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. Avant-garde jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making more self-expression, or more your vehicle for whatever technologies, cultures, and environments are dominant?
That's a tough one.
Thank you. You're a thinking man, Jacob, because it's like the woman who said the word more doesn't function in your question. Of course it's both, and it depends, but go ahead. I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, so I mean, if we take, like I do with McLuhan, this idea that we're shaped by our media. I mean, clearly we're shaped by our culture. I mean, part of what I find so fascinating about Stoker, and I promise I won't get off on him again, but it's like, it's so interesting to see the way that he is such a man of his time. I mean, his stuff, like, I think part of what makes him sort of inaccessible to the modern world is in several of his books, he's like despicably racist. and but it's not just his racism. It's like attitudes, like just he has attitudes that I'm the racism would obviously be like a bad thing, right? But there's other stuff about him that it's just of his time that we don't relate to each other this way anymore. And there's so you see Stoker being shaped by the media around him, by the culture around him, by the politics around him, and I think for us, we're especially shaped by our media. And this idea of like art being in the ether and you sort of channeling it, I think there's something to that. I think there's also, I think sometimes what we channel can be evil. I wonder that about Iggy Pop. I'm an immense admirer of him, right? But he called himself, I believe, explicitly a worshiper of Dionysus. I can't believe he was entirely kidding about that. Again, I think Iggy Pop may be the greatest rock musician. Him and like the Grateful Dead, maybe at least to me the most impressive rock musicians of all time.
Oh, that is good. Let me tell you on Iggy for a second, because he was valedictorian of his high school class at Pioneer High in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I spent a lot of time in Ann Arbor, and he was on the golf team. And he said this amazing thing that I'll set up for a question later on. My band was so bad at imitating the Rolling Stones, we invented punk rock, which is a great comment. But and then we could talk about the Dead forever. But Iggy is a great example of raw power. I mean, he's horrible. I've done Iggy Pop tribute nights, and the first question I ask, I go, why is Iggy overrated? And everybody in the room goes, no, that's why we're here to celebrate him. But he's so bad that he's good in a way. His lyrics are stupid, but he exudes what rock and roll is in so many ways, and he's important. So I love that your examples of who you like go from Iggy to the Dead, because Rodney Bingenheimer said the Grateful Dead killed rock and roll.
Yeah, I don't. It's interesting because Grateful Dead, speaking of sui generis, I mean, one of the interesting things about Grateful Dead is there are so many albums sound like they're just from a different universe and separate universes. Like their debut sounds totally different from the Mars Hotel. Both of those sound totally different from Blues for Allah. They all sound different from Shakedown Street or Go to Heaven, right? Like
you got good taste. Did you see the 4-hour doc on the Dead?
I did not. No.
Oh, you should see it. Did you see the Grateful Dead movie that Jerry directed?
I know.
Anyways, they're both good movies. I highly. Anyways, I don't want to go off too far on the Dead, but I got to tell you one really quick thing. In the middle of a Frank Zappa song, he makes fun of the Dead, and he goes, "I'll tighten my headband during Jerry's guitar solo for an extra rush," which is hilarious. I saw Jerry Garcia open for Frank Zappa one time in Chicago. So it was amazing. It was an amazing way to analyze the audience. So, what you're talking about is so important. This vehicle, like the Dead were a product of their time so much, but they were really good. Jerry Garcia is a great guitarist. Phil Lesh, Bobby Weir, blah, blah, blah. But this, you said that's a tough one. Is it more a vehicle or more self-expression? Let me follow it up. And again, Jacob, you can go off on tangents. Don't worry. Just because I shove these in, go off. Can art making be egoless?
I don't know. I think it's a false dichotomy, like the self-expression versus like an expression of the culture.
Yeah,
and
it is really, yeah.
And I don't really know, even egoless. Like I don't know. There's this. I don't know if this is true. Again, this could be me misreading something, but I think it's really beautiful. That I've read, as I recall, that there are certain like fixtures or paintings in Gothic cathedrals that are actually like positioned in such a way that nobody in the congregation can see them because they're only for God, which I think is like a really beautiful thought.
Yeah.
right? Where like this is an act of worship, and I feel like art, like that's what I want my art to be, is an act of worship. And so it's
Yeah.
like a perfect work of art to me would be that. And I'm trying to think, and I can't call it perfect, but I think a movie like Bad Lieutenant is such a beautiful Christian story, right? About this person who is like seemingly irredeemably evil and makes this decision in the end that's completely selfless, because because that nun blows his mind, right? Like, how can you forgive these men who came in and raped you?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how could you possibly forgive? And it completely alters his mental landscape and his template of what a human should be and how they should act. And there are these stories of it's interesting because like in ancient Rome, there's this idea back in the day that the wealthy and the young and the powerful, that's what good is. Nietzsche talks about this too. Like, Nietzsche hated Christianity in part because he saw it as an inversion of all values. He considered Socrates and Judaism as like the precursors to this inversion. But he called Christ the most sublime form of Jewish hatred, I believe is his language. And while I love Judaism, and in part because of this, I think that his point, I think he has, we come to it from the exact opposite perspective. Like, I think what Judaism and Socrates and Christ did were good. But the point he's making, I think, is accurate in the sense that in Rome, right, the most powerful person, the wealthiest, the best looking, the youngest, that was what good is. Evil is disease, old age, poverty, death, right? And then this guy comes along, this Jewish rabbi who happens to be God, saying the poor are rich, the weak are strong. And he inverts all these values. And so this warlike society who values conquering above all else, right, who values strength above all else, are blown away when they see in the Colosseums these people who love their enemies, who pray for those who persecute them, and who beg to go first, to be fed to the lions, and forgive their captors as they're torn into pieces, right? And so this warlike society, sort of like Harvey Keitel's character in Bad Lieutenant, sees this completely new way of living, and it transforms them, and it conquers, right? There's this, and it's apparently the quote is misattributed, but Julian the Apostate, like the last pagan Roman emperor who tried to turn Rome back from Christianity and make it pagan again, as he died, supposedly failing in his mission. This is a misquote, but supposedly his last words were, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean," right? Saying, okay, Jesus, you win. Right? Like, I couldn't do it. You're right, because all of their strength, all of their culture couldn't stand up to this strange, divine, poor carpenter who completely inverted their values. And so to me, again, can art be egoless? It's interesting because like, I don't know if a human can, without divine assistance, certainly could ever be egoless. But I think all art is religious art, whether the artist is aware of it or not. And so
all art is the what? I missed
is
that.
religious art, whether
Is
the
religious
artist.
art. Yeah. No, you really you tackled that beautifully, Jacob, because most people, 80% of people I ask, they go, "Can art making be egoless?" They go, "No." And about a year ago, a woman said, "Great art is egoless." And then a woman said, after her, a couple months later, great art has to be egoless. So it's not, the word ego carries baggage. They're not sure if I'm saying egotistical or putting yourself in it. I mean, these guys who do sand raking, whatever Eastern.
Oh yeah.
Maybe that's egoless. Maybe there are people who we could label, oh, that's egoless. But the point is that we're all trying to create something that others can relate to, whether good or bad, and it has a universality to it. So there is something about that, that it is totally a false dichotomy, as you say, and it's not a good question. I have to learn how to word it better. But in the meantime, I'm going to continue to ask it because I've had so many years of people reacting to it. And that's the way 80% say it. No. And I'm like, I think it can be egoless, but I don't dispute that to them. I'm more like you. I don't know, you know.
I don't think it's a bad question because it provokes like even saying it's a false dichotomy. I
Yeah,
think the fact that you can think through that means
yeah,
it's a good question.
yeah,
Because
that's it.
it doesn't lead you to the answer necessarily. It allows you to figure your own one out. So
So
yeah.
so here's this question comes later, but I want to insert it now because you brought up this twice this time. In Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength. And you've kind of typified it by talking there for, poor are rich, the weak are strong, because the other way I say it is tell me a rejection you turned into a redirection. So basically, is tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
I mean, what you're saying actually evokes this beautiful passage from Second Corinthians, where Paul he talks about there's some kind of like sin that he's dealing with. He says like God put this thorn in my side, an angel of Satan to afflict me. And a lot of people think he's talking about lust, or I mean, I haven't read a ton of commentary on the verse, but there's this idea that he's taken. There's some kind of sin or something that he's struggling with, and he said like 3 times I asked God to take it from me. And God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness, which I think is a really profound thing, right? Where it's like we don't depend on ourselves, we depend on him. In a less lofty sense, I mean, just personally,
Yeah.
my tendency toward distraction has actually helped me see a ton of horror movies because, I'm
Right. So you're saying you had a weakness and it was your tendency towards distraction. And how'd you turn that into a strength?
by watching movies in the background. And so it's like now I've seen, I can see 4 movies a day if I'm working and I get a lot of movies under my belt. I know which ones are good and which ones I can watch, undistracted at another time. And I get a much broader sense of the landscape of horror or other movies. Again, that's not like anything as profound as what Paul is talking about. But I think a lot of times you can turn
No, it's a good answer. You nailed it, dude. I'll tell you TSA. Did I tell you this last time? Tactile situation awareness, TSA. When the bomber dude is in his airplane and his plane gets hit, he doesn't have the time to check every gauge to save his life. He's got to act on instinct immediately. So he's not identifying with him being a pilot, studying gauges and knowing how to fly the plane. He's got to act on instinct. My friend said that's what kids do now. They, like in my day, we would smoke a joint, do our homework, and listen to an album. But that's sort of multitasking. Now kids can do Facebook, Instagram, watch a horror film, write a book, and watch a tutorial all at once, and they're not identifying with anyone in particular. It's more of a big picture, expansive way to explore it. Any thoughts on that TSA thing?
well, I mean, I wonder, right? Like, because I think we talked about this a bit last time, where what we're really getting at is moving into a more oral society. There's a lot of lamenting about the lack of literacy rates among
Yeah,
children, which I think is alarming. But at the
yeah,
same time, it's like our society isn't, we're not in a visual society in
yeah,
the same way
yeah,
as we used to be. And I think that also leads, Marshall McLuhan's vision of a global village is not a rosy one. Like he
yeah,
doesn't use rosy global villages. Oh, we're all happy together. I mean,
yeah,
the villagers are in Marshall McLuhan's world are not particularly polite, and they're dangerous, and they're superstitious, and they're violent.
yeah.
And so, at least for my money, I do. It's funny because like attention takes effort. Like to sit and read really does take effort. Even when I'm reading this great Bram Stoker novel again today, and I noticed Like this always happens to me. So if I'm reading something that I don't care that much about, it's like I just have to put it down in a few minutes. But with the Stoker book, the first couple pages were a struggle because I was just, my mind was in other places at first, and I had to like sit down and concentrate and then let the book take me, and eventually like it drew my attention, and then it's like that's what I want to be doing. And I think I have a more frayed attention than the average person probably. But I think putting that sort of demand on ourselves is actually really good, because it allows us, like, it's funny that like you call me like smart and articulate and all this stuff, and I don't think I'm actually like that much. I wouldn't see myself as smarter than the average person. I think I do different things than the average person. I think a lot of times when people say someone is smart, that just means that they've read books other people have heard about.
Yeah,
And
that's good. That's a good point. But I feel I'm learning from you, and that's when I call someone smart, because I'm learning. But when you're writing your book and you have a horror film going on in the background and you have other things going on, that distraction thing, when you're reading Stoker, are you having all this other stuff going on in the background too?
No, I mean, sometimes I'll get, I'll be texting on my phone or whatever, but that's what's so weird is like I read Wilkie Collins' Woman in White in like really quickly, and it's like 650 pages. So
without any things going on in the background.
Well, I mean, again, you'll get distracted by your phone, or with, like.
But no, I'm saying you say consciously you have a film going on.
No.
But when you're writing your stuff, you like that stuff going in the background,
especially during the idea phase.
When you're reading, it's less.
You can't. And when I'm editing, right? Like if I'm going back and rewriting, like I've had to do a lot of rewrites for this script recently, and thankfully we made the script a lot better, I think. But it's, if you're trying to go through, like the action or dialogue and say like, oh, is this word right or whatever, you can't have a movie on in the background because you're not going to pay attention to it. So you really have to just look at it and be really careful. But that initial sort of joyful phase of like, oh, I'm just playing, it's really tricky. Yeah, because a lot of times, like I would, my prose is really important to me. And so like, if you ever read my fiction, I'm like really serious about sentences. Like there are times when I've spent weeks on sentences, I've stopped writing the current novel I'm working on because it's like, it's too hard. And I feel like it's too uncommercial. It's going to take me another 3 years to write, and I'm so proud of it. But at the same time, it's like I worry that people, it has footnotes. It's a crazy story about a crazy guy.
Wait, is it fiction with footnotes?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's I had to ask you this. Have you ever read The Infinite Jest?
Yeah, I didn't like it.
Yeah, right. Did you read Pale Nabokov's book with footnotes?
I have not. So Infinite Jest, I should say. I think David. Wait, can I just say really quick? Like, I've only read like 400 pages of Infinite Jest, and I really didn't like it. Maybe I would return to it again, like with Tarkovsky or someone, and really love it. But like, that was one that
I haven't read it either. But I found out, because I'm going to send you an email and ask you to tell me the 10 most difficult books you rate, the 10 most difficult books. Don't do it now. I'm going to send you an email.
I could do it easy now, but
anyways, here's the thing. David Foster Wallace supposedly said he didn't read Finnegan's Wake, but he looked at every word in it, which is funny because you're talking about us being an oral society and not a visual society. And what do kids do all day but type? And now you turn text, vocal, you turn your mouth action, your sounds into text, and there's so many variations. So we got about 10 more minutes, Jacob, and we can do a part 3.
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah. But here's Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Likeness of Being. This is why I love writing, because the character that I'm writing about can go further than I can. Well, how can a character that you take a pen and write on a piece of paper go further than you can? Is that, I mean, that sounds, it's wrapped up in this thing. We also discovered, what's the difference between literal and metaphoric? If all language is metaphoric, then isn't the word literal a metaphor?
So can I read you a quote from another one of my favorite writers that I've been
Please.
obsessed with? Like, one of my biggest influences as a writer is a guy named John Hawkes, who is not the actor. He is a writer who he was sort of associated with postmodernism. He's a really strange writer. For some reason, he's been sort of forgotten, but his work is extraordinary.
Well, give me one title so I can do a search on it.
The Cannibal, The Lime Twig, Travesty.
Now, what did you get from him?
So, well, I want to read this quote from him because it's one of these quotes that I find infuriating, but I actually start to understand and I really relate. And this is part of why I think I might really love Stoker too.
Yeah.
Because Hawkes and Stoker, like I was really into Hawkes, and then like I jumped into a new Stoker novel, and I wondered why I was so taken by him. But so Hawkes says, I began to write fiction on the assumption that the true enemies of the novel were plot, character, setting, and theme. And having once abandoned these familiar ways of thinking about fiction, totality of vision or structure was really all that remained.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because so William H. Gass and John Hawkes both talk about, and they were friends, but they both talk about the idea of the novel being this like clearly artificial thing. Like what's great about a novel is its sense of artifice. And I think in Stoker, there is something deeply artificial, and I mean this is the highest compliment, where he creates worlds. There's a book he wrote called Lady of the Shroud, where I'm going to spoil it for you because no one's ever going to read this book. But actually, it's my cat just jumped. I don't know if you saw that, but Sadie is.
Okay. It's okay.
She wants to participate. Here, let's see if we can. Have you? Did we meet her last time?
No.
Hello, Sadie. She's emotionally distant, actually. I got her because I thought that she would be cuddly and friendly, and she's not very. But I love her anyway.
Good.
But so it's interesting about this book called The Lady of the Shroud, right? What happens in The Lady of the Shroud is it starts out as a vampire novel. It's like it was a few years after Dracula, which was his biggest hit. And it starts out as a vampire novel. And then about 200 pages in, you realize that she's not a vampire at all. And the story, like all the supernatural stuff, is just abandoned in the book. And you realize everything has a normal explanation. And the book is much longer than that. And for like another 150 or 200 pages, what it's really about is this guy going into this fictional Balkan country, because there are these there's all this discussion about the Balkan region during this time, and it's this, he's like essentially like colonizes it for England, but he gives it its independence, and he comes in and he saves the day, and all conflict is gone for like over 100 pages, and it's just him, honor after honor being bestowed on him, and all these weird like cultural quirks of the elites of this Balkan country called the Blue Mountains, like him taking over and him having honors bestowed on him, and him like being assimilated into this unusual world. And it's just world building for this country that never existed. It's like and it's, the whole thing is completely artifice. It's like what Stoker was interested in doing is just crafting this world, like putting you in this environment. And it's of the books that I would recommend people read by him, that would probably be second lowest besides Lair of the White Worm, which is a mess. And I think his brains were probably being rotted by syphilis at the time that he wrote that book, because it's so bonkers. Like it has great ideas, but A, it's like offensively racist, and B, it just doesn't work. But this one I would not recommend.
Did Ken Russell make a film of that?
He did, yeah.
How's
and
it's
bonkers, like most of Ken Russell's movies.
Wait, Jacob, you used the word bonkers several times. What do you give me a couple other words what you mean by bonkers?
Ken Russell's The Lair of the White Worm, as I recall, I need to rewatch it, but
But I
it's
mean just the word, not you don't what is when you say bonkers, because you used it earlier.
it's really goofy. It's really out there. It doesn't feel like a narrative, as I recall, in any
Yeah.
normal sense. It's very campy and self-consciously silly.
Okay.
Stoker's book, I think, is an earnest attempt at horror.
Yeah.
And there are things about it that are actually I would say Stoker, like, part of what sort of haunted me about that book, because that was the second of his books I'd ever read, and it was before I became obsessed. But part of what haunted me about that book is it may be the example of the best idea and the worst execution I've ever seen in a book. Like, the idea is brilliant, and the execution, it doesn't. Part of what's amazing about the ending of that book is, so they had like a shorter version, but the longer uncensored version, which I believe I read, it's not that it was censored, it was just like truncated by the publisher, from what I understand. But the longer version, there are huge chunks toward the end, like the climax of how they like kill the monster, that just genuinely make no sense. Like, it's not coherent. Like there's so many things about it that you're like, I don't know why they're here or doing this. It doesn't make any sense. We don't understand why she behaves the way she does. But there's so much that almost evokes Henry James in it, where this character is sort of going insane. That, like, he has these like psychological insights that I think are really interesting. There are things he does with mood that are really interesting, and there are things he does with like the central monster that are deeply unnerving. But Lovecraft actually called it one of the worst horror novels ever written, and I don't agree with that, because I do think the idea is brilliant. But the execution isn't. But anyhow, Lady of the Shroud, like, what's so special and what evokes Hawks for me is this idea of a truly artificial thing. Caviar, if you see it, is pure artifice. So is my novel, David the Sinner. I mean, I think that I would hope that my audience is moved by both of them, but they're so clearly a constructed thing. Magnolia is so clearly a constructed thing, or The Master, or Blade Runner, or Armageddon, right? Like its construction is part of, I think, what gives it that voice, to return to your question from earlier. Like, what gives it this singularity of vision, whether or not, people like Dickens or Wilkie Collins says, I start with character. And right now I'm actually starting with character in this new thing I'm going to start outlining tonight, because I got obsessed with, like, how can I make, I got really interested in writing a certain kind of character. But so often I'm interested in structure, and I'm like, it's speed. What's so amazing to me about Speed is its structure is so perfect. Like, if I taught screenwriting, like, I would teach Speed, or I would teach Collateral, Michael Mann talking about Collateral being a movie that's all second act. Did I mention that in our earlier conversation?
No, but that's a good point, and it's amazing.
Do you like that film?
I don't know that film, and I don't know Michael Mann very well, but I love him because when he was on the Oscars one year, they were having people show their favorite clip of all time, and he showed Tim Curry smashing the cockroach in Paths of Glory. And the scene where Tim sees the cockroach run across the last meal, then he the other character actor, him, Joe Terrell or something like that. He says, "Tomorrow that cockroach will have more life than me." And Tim kills the cockroach with his fist, and he goes, "Now you got the edge on him." And Michael Mann showing that in the Oscars was a way of saying Tim Curry was an important person in American cinema history. He was a favorite of Cassavetes and Kubrick's. That he's in 2 Kubrick films and several Cassavetes.
Which two?
He is the guy who shoots the racehorse in The Killing.
Okay.
That's Timothy Curry, and he's in Paths of Glory. He's one of the 3 guys at the fire who get killed. And there's a great story, Tim's crying. He's him. He's one of the greatest. He manhandled James Dean in East of Eden. He's he Quentin Tortellini dedicated the screenplay of Reservoir Dogs to Timothy Carey. And
Did you just call him Quentin Tortellini?
Yeah.
Okay.
and listen, but you know why? Because when Harvey Keitel got signed up for the film, he says, if Tim's in it, I ain't going to be in it. And Quentin had to make the decision not to use Tim. Anyways, he's important. He's in Minnie Moskowitz. Have you ever seen that, Cassavetes?
No, I actually haven't seen East of Eden either. But
okay, you should just watch Tim Carey improvise his scene in Minnie Moskowitz on YouTube. He's also in Killing of a Chinese Bookie. So blah blah blah. Anyways, I went off on.
Wait, can I just say really quick about Paths of Glory? It's interesting because that's one that I wanted to return to. I love Kubrick. I recently saw Killer's Kiss for the first time, which I think is great. I would highly recommend it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I haven't seen Paths of Glory probably since I hit puberty. It's been forever since I've seen Paths of Glory.
Watch Tim's part in it. It is amazing.
Right. That ending of him crying as they bring him to get shot, I still remember. That moment is horrifying. And it's like
Tim was my friend. He gave Zappa his first one of his first jobs scoring a film. He made a film called The World's Greatest Sinner and blah blah blah. Anyways, Tim was crying. Kubrick's filming the scene. Kirk Douglas is the star of the film and I think kind of producer. James Harris, who I asked all these same questions, produced the film, helped produce it. Kirk Douglas rides up on his horse and he says, Stanley, I'm the star. What are you having this guy? And Stanley turns to Kurt and goes, take a ride, get away from here. I'm filming Tim right now.
Yeah.
It's a great moment, in the history of cinema that you don't know about.
So I don't know if I'm just misreading this or whatever, but I remember reading that Kirk Douglas and Stanley Kubrick sparred on the set of Spartacus because Kubrick said that Spartacus is too flawless and he doesn't have any complication as a character. Yeah. And I guess Kirk Douglas disagreed with that. And it's interesting because when you see Spartacus, first of all, now, technically it's amazing in a lot of ways, but it's so corny because there's no depth to the character of Spartacus. And then also, if you know anything about Marxism, that movie is obviously communist propaganda. It's a beautiful movie, but it's so clearly it's not historically accurate and so clearly a communist movie, It's not, and again, it's I'm not saying that for or against its merit necessarily.
Yeah, but it's also, did you know Stanley was going to direct One-Eyed Jacks, and then Marlon took it over, and Tim is in. You ever seen One-Eyed Jacks by Marlon?
Ages ago, I remember loving it, but I don't remember.
Tim has to shove a woman's face in a bowl of chili. And it's a heavy scene because every time he goes for it, she starts crying. Anyways, you don't know this because you just see the scene as it comes across. There's a lot on Tim. His son Romeo Carey's a great filmmaker too, and he's been making docs on his dad. And if you can see The World's Greatest Sinner someday, check it out. It's like a bad Twilight Zone, but it is an amazing film that a Maverick made. It was sort of like Tim Carey was a character actor in Hollywood, and then he tried to make his own films, and World's Greatest Sinner is sort of notorious known. But let's end this session, Jacob, because we'll do more, and I appreciate it because you kind of touched on a lot there. But before we end it, I wanted to ask you used the word bonkers. Is that more a negative thing? And no, bonkers is not negative. Okay, is sick meaning, sick means it's good, or is sick means it's either bad or good? Is that
I usually don't use it in a good way. I feel like that's very California circa 2004. If I were listening to Alien Ant Farm at that point with board shorts, I would say that's sick. But
that's sick. When someone goes, that's sick, they mean it's bad.
Yeah, but bonkers. I mean, I want caviar to be bonkers. I want,
right. Bonkers is good, but sick is bad.
Yeah, depending on, I guess, depending on the context, but
Right, because just in general, I want to get a sense because I'm always interested in slang because it continuously changes,
there is no slang. I don't understand why. I mean, I understand why people use it that way, but it's like, the grammarian doesn't invent language. They
Right.
just categorize it.
They categorize it very good. Okay, so in regards to language, we actually talked about this in part 1, I believe, but I'm just curious your differentiating between matching and making. We've covered this a lot. This is McLuhan saying there's matching and there's making. And it's funny because Eric, his son, made a big distinction. He said the root word to make, the Latin root, is derived. The word fact, F-A-C-T, and the word fake, F-A-K-E, both derived from the Latin root word to make. So it's sort of that thing I'm talking about. How can you differentiate? What's the difference between literal and metaphor when literal is a word and it's metaphoric?
Yeah, I mean, and you can't I mean, you can't think without abstractions. And abstractions are never talking about concrete things. You say there's that tree, but we know what we're talking about, but we're using we're using abstractions even when we're talking about a tree, because we have to recognize what the category of tree is, what the form of tree is. And then we say, okay, I agree with you. Or you say, no, you're pointing at a yew or a rose bush or whatever. I wonder that question of artifice. It's like such a weird thing and such a big.
It's huge.
It's so Hawks. Again, I would highly recommend his work too. That one of the best. Something I would recommend to you of Hawks. It's like a 90-page book called Travesty.
Yeah,
and someone can that's one of his most accessible. Like a lot of his stuff is very experimental and difficult. But Travesty is this amazing book about a guy. It's a monologue. So the entire thing is a sustained monologue. And it starts out with this guy saying, hey, listen, he's talking to his friend in the passenger seat of a car. Hey, listen, I know I look like I'm going about 110 miles an hour on this French road right now. I know my daughter's in the back seat. But I just want to let you know that we're going to go for about 90 minutes. And, I'd run out of gas in about 2 hours. But we're going to go for about 90 minutes. And at the end of that 90 minutes, there's a brick wall that we're going to hit. And we're all going to die. And there's nothing you can, please don't argue with me. Don't, I see you crying, cry all you like, but spare your tears. I'm not stopping. I'm not slowing down. My foot is on the gas pedal, and that's it, right? We're all going to die. And the monologue is from that moment to him crashing into the wall. And the entire book is just this sustained monologue of this guy in this absolutely psychotic moment being like, I'm going to kill you all. I do not care. And I'm going to kill myself. And it's it's such a, it's darkly funny. And it plays with this idea that you have. And again, it's deeply artificial. It's beautifully crafted. His language is incredible. But it plays with this idea in you that you keep hoping. Right? You keep hoping, the other people in the car, you're going to stop, right? It's going to be okay. This is, you're talking to me right now, that surely something could change your mind. Why would you do this in the prime of your life? Why would you kill yourself and all of us? And he, and it's amazing the way that it plays with the reader's expectation, and it keeps turning them toward this, toward them having to reconcile themselves with the fact that it's you're not getting out of this car, and it's not going to be okay. You're going to tell yourself it's going to be okay so you don't panic, but it's not, and so I would highly recommend that book.
Have you heard, Jacob, have you heard this joke? Because it sounds they got it from that book. What year is Hawks writing Travesty about?
Sometime between the mid 60s and 70s here. I can tell you exactly.
Okay, that's enough. Here's the joke. Have you heard this joke? I want to die like my grandfather, who died in his sleep peacefully while he was driving a car, and all the people in the car were screaming and yelling. Have you heard that joke?
I have, yeah.
Isn't that joke what they must have got it from Hawks' novel?
Maybe, yeah. it's
or
funny.
he got his novel from that joke.
It's so strange because Hawks is such an amazing writer, and I think there's one adaptation of his work called The Blood Oranges, which I think was really poorly received. I don't know, like I think it was just like basically like a soft porn movie. I don't know. I haven't seen it, so I shouldn't say anything about
Well,
the.
Blood Oranges, that's funny because the guy who invented my hometown, Venice, California, invented the blood orange.
I love Blood Oranges.
Abbott Kenny. Okay, can you go a few more minutes? Because I
Sure.
will ask one. Okay, then you said I could name 10. Let's name the 5 most difficult books and how you rate them 0 to 10, 10 being the most difficult.
So these for me are like all tens.
Okay, they're all 10s. Go ahead.
So I actually think the writing of Paul is incredibly difficult in a lot of ways.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
But in a good way. But I think
Yeah.
it's very challenging. A lot of times it's like you're not entirely sure, like he'll refer to stuff that happened in the ancient world that we aren't totally sure about. But then also I think there's something that like requires spiritual maturity at times that I don't possess to fully understand what he's getting at.
Yeah.
So I find the writing of Paul to be very difficult. I find Hegel to be very difficult. I don't like Hegel, but I read the Phenomenology of Spirit. I actually haven't read the prologue, but the Phenomenology of Spirit I find to be an incredibly difficult book that I think Hegel simply could have been clearer about a lot of his ideas, and I kind of wonder if that betrays a lack of conviction in his ideas. I find Hegel to be annoying and gross, sick in the traditional sense of the word, but I find Hegel to be very difficult. Ulysses naturally is a really hard book to read. I love Ulysses though. I think it's a beautiful book. Let me think. I think the work of Eliot is. I know you think he's under or overrated, but I find Eliot to be very difficult but very rewarding.
Wait, no, I don't know. All I know is quotes by Eliot. You mean T.S. Eliot?
Yeah, but I remember
Yeah,
you being quoted on your Wikipedia article or something. It says that you consider T.S. Eliot overrated.
Really? Wow. No,
We talked about this last time.
No, I don't consider T.S. Eliot over. That's a misconception or something. I don't know Eliot enough. All I know is Eliot is hugely important in his essays talking about what poetry is and I mean, he kind of started the first Finnegan's Wake reading club in 1947 in New York City. So anyways, yeah, that's I would agree.
The
No,
Wasteland.
I haven't read. I should read Proof Rock and Wasteland. I haven't read them. I would say they're massive. Those are very important. I think Eliot is a huge influence on Joyce, and I'm more a Joycean, but I haven't read much Joyce. I'm really a Wakean. So
I haven't read The Wake. I've read Portrait of the Artist, which I consider incredibly difficult, and Ulysses. But it's interesting about Eliot. Speak of anxiety of influence, like he's one of my biggest influences, and I'm not that well versed in him, but I remember like just discovering poetry early in high school, like thinking that poetry was just all love poems and stuff because I didn't know it, and then I took this poetry class. And starting to read Langston Hughes or people that these aren't love poems; these are people like trying to plumb the depths of the soul. And I remember thinking like, I want to get some book of poems that I can just read in the hall or whatever when I have downtime. I'm like, well, what could be simple and I'd like? And here's a book of T.S. Eliot. And I remember starting him and thinking like, what in the hell is this? Like, this is impenetrable. I think the first book in this little volume, it was a Signet Classics, poems of Eliot, and it was. A chunk of, I think it was called The Death of Saint Narcissus. And it was just impenetrable. And reading Proof Rock over and over again and not realizing what it was about at all. And then realizing, it's about an old man and it's about sex and it's about all this stuff. And internalizing, like reading over and over again and looking at the footnotes. Thank God they had footnotes. I mean, thank God, literally, like they had footnotes, and it really formed me. It helped form me as a writer to realize, like, wow, this is incredible what he's doing, because he creates this kind of text that it sort of gets deep inside you because it like almost commands you to memorize it. Do you know what I mean? Like.
No, you made a good point about it, because Eliot's close to Pound too. Pound, I know, is important, but I don't know him because I've read him. I've read about him. I mean, anybody who studies Finnegan's Wake or James Joyce, It's more, I haven't read it, but I know it's an important book. It's called The Pound Era by Hugh Kenner. It's like very important to read. I just know about it. Okay, let's go
Hold
through
on,
it.
let me get a water really quick. Hold on.
Yeah.
But so what I would say about so Pound, when I was in college, I remember I had a professor he's a wonderful professor. But I remember like we went on this study abroad trip to England. And I was so obsessed with Pound that I remember him one time saying like Jacob is playing Pound, because Pound was like my favorite writer at that point.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Pound is such a complicated figure, right? Like some people you'd say, oh, they're they're a product of their time or whatever, but Pound was legitimately an anti-Semite. Like he was.
Oh, I know.
He was a legitimate racist, but he's also, it's interesting to read his work because his work is as dense as Eliot's. It's not as beautiful, and at the end of his life, he actually called himself a minor satirist. So he sort of dismissed his work. But if you ever want to get into Pound, I would highly recommend. There's a Penguin volume. It may or may not still be in print, called Early Writings. And it's a great volume of some of his earliest poems, and he really is. I mean, he's remarkable, and part of like the modernists, all like that feeling of something that needs footnotes and something that you really need to study and internalize, and it's all these references are together. Like I started in film school, like I started wanting to be a filmmaker, and that turned me into what, like I was more impressed by the modernists than I was by directors like Tarkovsky, who I thought like that was the height of art. And then,
dude, you were smart to cross over, because Mallarmé says everything ends up with a book. So it's, cinema's 130 years old. It's a pretty good medium, but it's not. But it's really cool how you dove in. You started in film and dove into literature.
But then I came back to film. I mean, ultimately,
I know.
I do both,
but you're still both, and you know that books are important. But let me just say, McLuhan used to visit Pound in his mental hospital. Did you know that?
Oh, is that true?
Pound, the best. One of the best books you could get is The Letters of Marshall McLuhan. That and you see the letters he wrote to Pound. Blah blah blah.
Have you ever heard Pound talk?
Nah, I should.
He sounds like a crazy person. He rolls his R's. He's like, speaking of bonkers, and it's interesting because Pound died in 1973. So I think, and so it makes sense that and I don't know if Pound was in the hospital at that point, but he's such a peculiar character. Because again, it's like if you hear him talk, he sounds like someone who has like crafted his own myth. Like I wonder what he must have been such a nerd in middle school. You know what I mean?
What's the line? All the news to fit, blah blah blah. Let me run through a cut. I don't have much more time, but Jacob, this is fun. Did you mention William Gass earlier?
I did, yeah.
Okay, now is he difficult? Would you put him in the difficult character?
So I haven't read The Tunnel. Which is like his magnum opus. I think that Gass is difficult, but not difficult in the way that Joyce is.
Not a 10. You wouldn't rate Gass as a 10 difficult.
Not any of the stuff. I think he's difficult. I think he's difficult like John Hawkes is, or like William Gaddis, if you know Gaddis.
I was just said Gaddis is next on my list.
So Gaddis, I've only read JR and Agape, so I'm not like an expert on him. JR is
you would rate both Gass and Gaddis more like 5 difficult or 8?
No, I mean I would say like 6 or 7, but they're not like Hegel. Like some of Hegel is so difficult, not just because there's no. I actually think Aristotle is one of the most difficult. He's a writer that I have difficulty reading because I think he's incredibly boring, and B, I think that there are passages in physics. I mean, maybe I'm not smart enough, but I remember I was reading. This was way back in the day in grad school, but I was reading. On Interpretation by Aristotle. And I remember seeing this footnote, like I got a commentary and the note on the paragraph was like, it's something like, we're not exactly sure what this means. And I think there are passages in Aristotle, and again, maybe I'm just wrong about him or something because other people seem to understand him fine. But I find Aristotle to be.
No, that's fine. I'm just doing this survey I'm making a list. I'm a list maker. Okay, now Cormac McCormack. What's his name?
Cormac McCarthy. I don't find him. I mean, I think he's like a 3 difficult, or maybe like a 5.
Okay, good. 3 to 5. Okay, how about Pynchon?
I have never finished a book by Pynchon.
Yeah.
I find him exhausting,
Yeah.
but I think he could be a really great writer. I don't think it's fair of me to say anything. I wish you would
Okay.
just delete when I said I find him exhausting. I just, I don't really, I don't, I actually think P.T. Anderson's Inherent Vice is one of his best movies. I think it's a beautiful adaptation and a beautiful movie. I don't get Pynchon. I'm not saying I think he's an amazing prose writer.
Yeah.
He's an amazing stylist. I've never been able to finish one of his books, and I just don't get him. So I feel like I'm a bad person to ask about Pynchon.
Don't worry. You're not a bad person at all in anything. It's really been fun, Jacob. I really appreciate your time and energy. I learned a lot.
Of course. Wait, you got to tell me who you find difficult. You can't say we've
Well,
already gone through choice.
I'm not I grew up in front of a TV.
Well, who do you find difficult though? You can't say Joyce. Joyce is out.
Here's the thing. I did my Ulysses reading club last night. It just is fun, but it does not touch me like The Wake. There's something about The Wake. I didn't really grow up reading Dubliners, Portrait. I should have known all that stuff, but I've never been a good reader. Literally, I grew up, watching Dick Van Dyke Show, and I wasn't reading books, but I got straight A's. So I knew how to go to my dad and help me do my homework, and I knew how to get over on teachers like I was smart. So I always got great marks through high school and college, and then I can come off as an intellectual because I can read articles about people and then act like I know what I'm talking about. So running a Finnegan's Wake reading club for nearly 3 decades, I learned a lot about Joyce. But I don't find The Wake difficult. I find it, like Chris Marker said, how can you escape time? If you're reading The Wake with a group of people, not analyzing it, just for 1 hour, you can lose time. And some people go, it's like a psychedelic experience. No, it could be like that, but it's like any good art. When you're watching a movie or reading a book and get completely consumed in that, then that is a way of kind of losing a sense of time. And that's so I don't, difficult, everything is difficult for me to read. I mean, when I'm reading books about Joyce, it's difficult, but I kind of say, oh, I learned this little tidbit or that. And so it's funny because you said you're writing an experimental novel now. I'm writing an experimental novel now with another person. But it's a hodgepodge. It's called mosaic writing. So I want to think that my reader might find something, but it's all in code. It's like Finnegan's Wake. So why are you putting in code? People want to read because they want to feel. There's 2 really important things you evoked by asking that question. People want to feel like John Lennon said about Finnegan's Wake in the $100 Beatles book, whatever it's called. I got a copy over there. I bought it for $0.25 at the library on sale. I mean, it's literally a hardcover this big. And it says, John Lennon, when he was reading Finnegan's Wake, it said he felt like he was talking to a friend. Okay, that's a poetic, romantic way to explain The Wake. Last week, 2 people separately said, in getting them to read The Wake, they said it felt like I was having a stroke. Another guy reading The Wake last week, a poet, said it was charming. So that's a pretty wide range for something that's as difficult as The Wake to be called, it gave me a stroke and it's charming.
Yeah.
So then the punchline to the John Lennon story is the guy who shot John Lennon was carrying a copy of Catcher in the Rye in his back pocket. And in that book, Holden Caulfield says, when I read a good book, it feels like I'm talking to a friend. So it's like anything humans put between each other is why McLuhan said technology is the most human thing. So if you put printed word, moving image, eye contact, You put us in a Zoom for 2 hours. Anything is what life's all about, is exchange and community and connecting with another human being. That is the essence of life, in my opinion. And Wyndham Lewis, the sort of anti Joyce of, his peer, but he was probably loved Wyndham Lewis and hated him, whatever. He said, artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. So the point of life is to live in the moment. So when I'm reading Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people, I feel like I'm living in the very moment that I'm living, because I'm looking at printed words, black ink on white paper, and I'm hearing other people mispronunciate this gobbledygook, which isn't gobbledygook. There's words in it that work, but it's sort of imaginary, what you use a great word, abstraction. But no, there's 5 words that make sense, and then there's an abstract word. So you're hearing other people kind of read for you, because you're turning an eye experience, books are an eye experience, into an ear experience.
Yeah.
So it's called sense ratio shifting. So last night, one of our readers of Ulysses is like, the greatest reader. He's like a actor, he can read it perfectly. I just felt like I was being read a play. It didn't do what the Wake does to me. So to answer your question, I find everything difficult to read, but I try to. It's so much easier for me to just find one of your YouTube videos and watch a tutorial and put the subtitles on. So I'm reading the text and I'm learning from someone telling me with eye contact or cool visuals and the text. But I'm just writing this list I got in. Do you ever read Umberto Eco?
No, I hear good things. He's on my
Yeah,
list.
he writes about list making. There's various people, and you're well read. Is there anyone you've ever read that make lists?
I mean, I think immediately of like the Book of Lists, right? The David Walachinsky book. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Book of List. How do you spell his last name?
I think WALLACHENSKY. I just remember it because a good friend of mine.
I know that the Book of List. Yeah, I got to look that up.
Yeah, it was like a precursor to Uncle John's bathroom reader back in the day.
Yeah, Uncle John's.
Yeah, it's like a weird assortment of odds and ends. It's like a weird anthology of unusual facts.
But I mean, isn't that what we're doing, Jacob, in the long run?
Yeah.
We're doing what Duchamp did. Duchamp is one of those guys like Joyce, like Jackson Pollock. It comes to that point, there's nothing post Duchamp. It's all Duchamp, and then they're all Duchamp wannabes. They're all, in my opinion, there's certain people like that. For you, that you can name some. It all comes to there. Duchamp said the artists of the future will only have to point. So all Joyce did was, how'd you write Finnegan's Wake? He says, I didn't write it. The people at the coffee house there's talking wrote it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard it said before that the Wake should be read aloud. And I remember reading like 20 pages of it and feeling that way too, and thinking it was funny and unusual.
But you have to read out loud with a group of people. That's the key. It's not just out loud by yourself. Anyways, it can work, if you meet something. I know the question I wanted to ask you.
Wait, hey, I wanted to ask you a question.
Okay,
sorry to interrupt you. But have you ever heard of those like erotic letters that were supposedly found from Joyce to his wife?
Oh, of course. It's in the book Nora.
Yeah, okay, so I kind of wonder. So the perspective currently is that Joyce was a weird pervert that was obsessed with human feces and all this stuff. Now that's a possible interpretation, but I also kind of wonder if he did it as a prank, where he like literally left it in his house, knowing that people would discover it, and just to see like what they would do in the future. Do you know what I mean? Like
just did that. What you said, Jacob, was great. Joyce isn't a weird pervert, but you know who's the weird perverts? All the intellectual people. I've interviewed almost every great Joyce scholar on my podcast. They all know that they kind of vicariously can live weird and talk about weird sexual and poo-poo caca shit because it's by the greatest writer in the world.
Yeah,
so he doesn't legitimize it. He just makes it able so you can talk about it. Same with Zappa. Zappa's thought of as potty, teenage potty humor. And so he's saying, dude, I'm just singing. Zappa said, I'm a documentary reporter. I'm just reporting what is around me. And so then you go, well, no, you're propagating it. Hey, look at the guy you mentioned, Marilyn Manson. He ripped off Marshall McLuhan lines and put them in his lyrics.
Oh, I didn't know.
Is he a rapist? Who knows? Are they going to prove it it sounds like he did some weird shit and women are accusing him, but it all goes to court case. Zappa wrote a line, something with the cheerleader. The cheerleader will help with my paper. Then I'll go home and rape her. Now, he wasn't propagating rape. He was mirroring what jocks would do. But if you hear the lyric, some people go, Frank's saying he approved rape.
Right. So I can't really, I don't really know almost anything about Marilyn Manson. So yeah. Like I shouldn't really comment there. What I would say in terms of, where were we actually?
You were asking, did Joyce?
Oh yeah, the Joyce thing. So it's interesting.
Joyce did everything as a prank.
That's what I wonder. I wonder if actually those letters were not actually to his wife at all.
I would say he loved to smell Nora's underwear, which isn't stupid or bad.
So how do we know though? Because the thing is it's interesting because he was like, if he's trying to create his own myth, right? In my mind, I just think it's a very funny thing to do, to leave in his records this idea that he loved poo. And like to have the entire, because I remember in after Joyce, or after the wake, supposedly he said, with this I will keep scholars busy for years. And I just think it would be a hilarious thing to do, to be in addition, their footnotes and their commentaries, they're going to have to point out that I wrote these really weird letters to my wife.
But this is really important. You don't know. These people go, did Joyce, was it a big leg pull? That's the word they use, leg pull.
Joyce, so people have asked that question too.
Huh?
People have asked that question about the letters.
No, the whole book, Finnegan's Wake, is a leg pull.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah. No, in everything, Joyce, look at, you analyze and analyze and analyze. That's what scholars do. It doesn't mean they know. If Joyce says, I am, like Frank Zappa says, I am very serious about being not serious.
Yeah.
So was Frank serious? He was a very serious guy, but he loved humor. He wrote a whole concert called Does Humor Belong in Music? Now he knows humor belonged in music, but he didn't want to be preachy. He asked the question. So these guys were like Marshall. They were inventing new questions and new metaphors. So that can be interpreted various ways. The thing about shit is Africans use shit to make art, and we use shit to grow plants. It's fertilizer. So you got to realize, oh my God, I'm turned off by shit. Chuck Berry had women pee on him. That's gross. It's like, well, maybe in some sense, that's okay in the big picture. But me and you probably don't want anyone peeing on us,
Well,
or we think it's in a legit way to get your rocks off.
so yeah, I'm not sure where in Africa you're referring. I have a lot of friends who are African who I think would probably be, because it's such a vast continent. There's so many
Right. And
cultures.
I mean, everybody uses, I read it somewhere that somebody in Africa used it. So I brought it up. I can't document it right now. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just, yeah, I'm not actually even like judging
Yeah.
whatever Joyce was into. Like what I'm sort of getting at more is I kind of wonder if the entire thing could have been a literary prank in that, like,
Most people think you're right, Jacob. That,
oh, really?
well, yeah, no, I mean, most people, because if you talk to anybody at a cocktail party and goes, you ever read Joyce? And they go, oh, Ulysses is one of the greatest books ever. Did you ever read Finnegan's Wake? They go, he went too far there. And,
Yeah.
That's like, dude, that's the whole point of Finnegan's Wake, is to go too far.
But I mean the letters. I mean
The letters were probably true to a point. He wrote letters to Nora and said, I love to sniff your underwear. So what?
But no, I'm not. Again, I'm not judging good or bad, I'm not. It doesn't
Right,
matter.
I know.
And
But
maybe it is.
Was he manufacturing his own PR? Look at, who's the master.
That's what I mean. Is like, I wonder if he thought it was hilarious.
Everybody, who? Okay, I can tell you this. That's what Bob Dylan's whole career is.
Of course.
Bob Dylan's a master at it. And guess who taught this? The guy who you use the word modernist. The guy who brought modern art to America had an affair with Georgia O'Keeffe. What's his name? He's a famous photographer. I can't think of his name. You can look it up. He taught Georgia O'Keeffe how to do PR. So the whole history of Georgia O'Keeffe, my friend wrote a book on Georgia O'Keeffe because she was kind of, I don't want to say bullshitty, or as I say, PR, public relations, is professional lying.
Do you mean like Edward Bernays?
Well, Edward Bernays is chalked off as doing something bad because he was brainwashing. Jacques Rouel says propaganda is just culture in action. McLuhan nailed it. He got it all, dude. He said advertising is a cave art of the 20th century. It's a cave art of the 21st century, the 22nd century. He learned the techniques of advertising. All the great artists go through advertising. Stop your career, Jacob. Go work in advertising for 2 years, and then you'll probably end up a better writer because you're going to learn. I'm not saying you have to or you will. David Mamet, Frank Baum wrote Wizard of Oz, Frank Zappa, Andy Warhol. They all worked in advertising first because they learn how to create the disease and offer the cure. They know what Mallarmé and the symbolists learned from your first guy, Poe. Poe is effects precede causes. So you want to, Mallarmé said it, don't paint the painting, paint the effect you want the painting to have. Right. You already know this. You know this. So that's what they're doing. All these people are doing it. The key is, and then you go into technological determinism. Did Hitler cause World War II? No. The radio caused World War II. No, Hitler caused it. Well, the radio had a big part of it. What caused Civil War? The telegraph. What caused 9/11? The cell phone. Blah, blah, blah. That's like technological determinism. Well, in a way, McLuhan's kind of technological determinist light. But here's the key. He blended it with Menippean satire. So you got to study what Menippean satire is. Rabelais, Alice in Wonderland, The Symbolist, Finnegan's Wake. It's using the medium. And I learned this about T.S. Eliot once. Someone said, I think Four Quartets has how to read the poem in the poem. So do you know what Manipian satire is? It's everything you grew up on. Simpsons, South Park. It's
I don't know the word Manipian.
yeah, well, look it up. You use the medium itself as part of the satire.
Okay.
So it becomes integrated. Satire is like, I'm going to make fun of you and you're going to laugh, blah, 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 But it's deeper with Manipian satire, not deeper, it's different with Manipian satire because it's Woody Allen in the middle of Annie Hall
Yeah.
turning to the audience and going, wouldn't it be great if life was like this?
Right.
You're not supposed
and
to
actually
break
pulling out Marshall McLuhan of all people.
It'd be just after he pulled out Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall McLuhan was manipulated to use an aphorism as a statement instead of a question. So Marshall's question, he would ask, do you mean my whole fallacy is wrong? That's a question. Woody had him say it as a statement. You mean my whole fallacy's wrong. That's the opposite of Marshall. But Marshall actually had another aphorism that really explained that. A half a truth is still a lot of a truth. So at least you got me to say one of my lines, but it's actually backwards. Mm-hmm. So all the power to him. Woody kind of made him famous. You know why? Because Fellini and Buñuel weren't available.
Yeah.
They were, but let me ask you, these are the funnest times, Jacob, when I go, oh, we're only going to go 90 minutes. We're going 2 hours and 10 minutes. But this is something I really wanted to ask you, and I will ask you now if you got the moment. Louis Buñuel said, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. Okay, that's an amazing thing. A guy raised Catholic like Zappa, they kind of diss or use all their art to diss the church or make fun of the church or make comments on the church, but it is part of their life so much it's not going to go away. It's part of who they are. So he says, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. 99% of people I say that quote to go, I agree with that. One guy finally said, that's bullshit. Because if I'm going to seek something, it's because I want to find it. So I morphed it into this question. If the journey is more important than the destination, why do we have to name or seek a destination?
Well, yeah, I think I don't know about the journey question. I mean, I think that can be read in a lot of ways. I also would agree that Buñuel, that quote, at least from the context that you've given it, is bullshit. I think there's a sickness.
Louis would love for you to say that.
I think there's a sickness in Joyce too.
Explain to me why 90%, 99% of people love it.
I can't judge anyone else, but I think there's a sickness in Joyce too, right? And this is coming from someone who's a Catholic convert and pretty sick myself, right? I'm in no way perfect. I'm not pretending any sort of holiness, but to me, Christ says, "Seek and you will find," and I think that doesn't mean that you're automatically holy or whatever. But I think there's Kurosawa said something like, "The task of the artist is to refuse to look away." And that I think gets much closer. I remember in our first interview where I said I feel like my art is a prayer from someone better than myself. And to me, there's this beautiful quote in Gaudium et Spes, which is one of the Vatican II documents, and I'm going to get it wrong, but. So forgive my misinterpretation here, and don't take this as magisterial teaching because I'm going to get it wrong. But it's something about something that indicates that history will culminate at the point when all mankind is seen as an offering acceptable to the Father. And it's like I think art is the quest to make an offering acceptable to the Father, or at least that's
Yeah.
what I want my art to be. And
Yeah.
so and again, like if you see Caviar, or if you read David whenever it comes out, God willing, you'll say like how you're a madman. David, I think you would see it much more because it's much more explicitly religious.
Yeah.
But there's like I don't know. I think art is supposed. This is why I love horror so much, because I think it's supposed to wrestle with the greatest spiritual questions.
Yeah.
And you know, like what are we doing if we're not wrestling with those questions?
Yeah.
And I think that to quote Whitman, you know, like I am this mystery, here we stand.
Yeah.
And I think we're in front of something extraordinary. And there's you know, there's this sort of puzzle that always recurs to my mind, which I never hear anybody ask, and it's probably just because I'm not well read enough. That it's, surely this has occurred to far greater minds than mine. But the idea that like throughout the billions of years of the existence of the universe, how is it that I am looking through my eyes alone? Right? Why am I not looking through your eyes? Why am I not this computer? Why am I not a rock on the planet Venus?
Yeah.
You know, 3 million years ago. Why is
Yeah.
it that I am me right now and I am not you, that I am localized in this consciousness? That's absolutely miraculous. And it's something that's so taken for granted that
Yeah.
we do not see it as being inherently miraculous. And to me, that means, you know, to quote the psalmist, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. There's something, and I don't have an answer for that yet, right? Like it's something sometimes I just like to sit in and say,
Yeah.
like, why is it that I am me? I used to be part of this, I used to study Gurdjieff, who I think is a villain
Yeah.
now. I find Gurdjieff disgusting, sick
Yeah.
again in the, you know, there are a lot of nice people there that I have great admiration and love for, but I just, Gurdjieff as a man, I'm not a fan of. But I remember asking that question, my group meeting, and one of the leaders saying like, you'll never find an answer to that question.
Yeah.
I'm like, and at the time I just accepted it because I thought these people were all sages and correct. And they're people I admire a lot, that I count as friends, but not at all that I agree with anymore. And to me, it's like that should have been the point where I said, nope, that's bullshit. You're wrong. That's an extraordinary question. It's an extraordinary thing to actually recognize that I'm looking through my eyes right now. You're looking through out of everything that could, you know, Dave Matthews talks about it in his song Dancing Nancy's, right? Like, could I have been a parking lot attendant? Could I have been a billionaire in Bel Air, right? But also, could I have been anything at all, right? Like, could I have been anything at all? And the fact that I am this right now, that I am this peculiar identity, and not only peculiar but unique as far as we know, right, is again, this is miraculous and it's metaphysical. This can't be explained by any materialistic answer. What does that mean? We're sitting in front of something that's absolutely extraordinary, and to dismiss it or to try and make well, you know what, here's something. Gurdjieff, who again I'm not a fan of, said something that I think is very true, right? Because I think a lot of times artists try to be clever. And Gurdjieff said he is stupid who is clever. And that I agree with. Because it's not about being clever. Like, we don't have time to be clever, right? And I try to be clever plenty, right? So I'm not at all saying that I'm in any way.
Jacob, that's the history of all my heroes. Frank Zappa, Duchamp, McLuhan, and Joyce they're fucking stupid because all they want to be is clever. But
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's
they're
true.
a little deeper, but Zappa nailed it. He said stupidity is the building block of the universe. Not knowing is how you learn, because we become comfortable in saying I know something, like the Buñuel thing, and then it's hard to unlearn or learn something new because you become comfortable in your setting. So, I mean, Gurdjieff, I had the exact same thing. One of my best friends and teachers ever was a Gurdjieffian for years, and then he hated him. Same turnaround. But I love one Gurdjieff quote I use a lot. Laughter is the reconciliation of yes and no. So what is it that makes us laugh? It's this, it's this binaries that kind of make us work. Auden, the word you used good, Jacob, there was mystery. Auden kind of said the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. So maybe Zappa Duchamp, McLuhan, and Joyce have just pacified me from really living life, or maybe they've enabled me to live life deeper with more meaning. I don't care which it is. I've had fun investigating them and having fun with them. That's the key. Joyce's word, fun for all. That's funeral. Fun for all.
But I mean, that sounds like a warning too.
That's clever. Yeah. You mean the word or the whole thing I just said?
Yeah, the whole thing you said.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it's because I would not put McLuhan in that camp at all. I don't think he's needlessly clever. I think.
Oh, he's a charlatan.
Oh, I disagree. I think he's like I think I wouldn't call him a prophet in the true sense, but I think he's incredibly prescient, and I think he's sounding the alarm bells of doom.
Well, I don't think you studied the other three that deeply then, because here's the thing: Marshall said things like he said funny things, and he was constantly using humor. I'll tell you. I'll tell you why I think he was a charlatan, but he didn't maybe set off to be a charlatan. He tried to be an academic, and he was a successful academic. He wrote 22 books, but they're chalked off. Richard Schenkel, one of the greatest film writers of all time, was at a party with my friend, and my friend said, "What do you think of McLuhan?" Schenkel quoted McLuhan in a book 30 years before. He says, this was just a couple years ago, before Richard died. He goes, "What do you think of McLuhan?" Richard goes, "Fraud." And then he says, I said, "You should have said, what do you think of Menippean satirist?" He didn't say anything. And then Richard cut back in and said, "Well, semi-fraud." So, one last thing in that regard that you're not regarding Marshall, and that's really good for you to say that, separating my four and saying that one isn't.
Well, I just think.
Let me just say Donald Thiel's fine. Donald Thiel was one of the great McLuhan students who wrote great books. Look up Donald Thiel, Theall. He's got essays. You don't even have to buy the books. Just read his essays. Joyce, McLuhan, and Marshall kind of dissed him, and he didn't think he got it. But I think Thiel summarized Marshall. Marshall McLuhan teased people to believe his percepts were concepts, to believe people that his intuitions, his guesses, his questions, his probing were theories. He teased people. They weren't theories. It says in Wikipedia, media theorists. It says in my Wikipedia page, I talk about McLuhan's media theory. That's wrong. He said, "I don't do theories," but he is in academia, and he's writing things that sound like theories. That's why he's considered a fraud.
So I just strongly disagree in that I think so much of what Marshall McLuhan said has come true, and I think something else he said that I'm sure that you're familiar with. I'm gonna get it wrong. It's been a while. So I'm rusty on my McLuhan.
That's all right.
But something to the effect of, like, the publisher initially seeing Understanding Media saying, like, there aren't many references in this. There aren't many notes. And he's like, how can I make notes? I'm doing something entirely new. And that most intellectuals, what they're doing is they're looking in, like, the back mirror, like analyzing culture. And I'm trying to look.
It's called rear view mirrorism.
Yeah, right. And I'm trying to look forward. And what I think McLuhan, it's true that he, as far as I've read, it's like he's not like a coherent thinker, like he's not systematic like Aristotle or Hegel, but at the same time, I think there are a series of concepts that are almost impossible to shake and that are absolutely true about the way media interacts with society, about these extensions of man, about the way that it shapes us.
That he didn't have theories. It's that Thiel was saying he teased people to believe his questions.
Right, but that's not a charlatan.
But in the long run, he did have theories that could be considered theories, like extensions of man. But he got extensions of man from your guy Whitman, and he got extensions of man He got Medium as a Message from Ashley Montague. He got Global Village from Wyndham Lewis. He got all his fucking main things. Excuse me. He got all his main ideas from other people and sort of reworded them, and he would admit it. But it wasn't that he was ripping them off. He was doing the back to Harold Bloom thing. He was absorbing his influences, personalizing him to Marshall, and then abandoning him.
Right, because I don't know Wyndham Lewis at all, but like in general, like every time he does a reading of any writer, his interpretation, speaking of a word we've used often, is bonkers, right? Like his reading of stuff is off the wall, and it's like he willfully misinterprets stuff in order to fit it into these ideas. And again, which I mean, I guess someone could call him a charlatan for that, but I think that he's reimagining like the whole history of literature. Yeah, I think McLuhan is a colossus. Like to me, there are thinkers who
I'm glad you got him. Jacob, go survey 20, 30 of your intellectual people and ask them what they think of McLuhan. I mean, you're a fluke. Did your teachers teach you McLuhan, or did you?
No, nobody gives a rip about McLuhan, but I think a lot of those people, I think like I haven't read enough Frankfurt School people to say, but like a lot of the stuff that people are into with Marxism, like to me, Marx is in a way a fraud. He's one of the great influences in terms of like the people that blew my mind, but like Marx, I find despicable. And
that's funny because here's the cliche line I use all the time. Marx said we can change things. McLuhan would say, Carl, you can't change diddly squat because your inventions change you. Now that's very reductive. I think Marx is important, but I don't know diddly squat about him. He's just another thinker, and I don't diss him. You ever see that guy's movie on young Karl Marx? That movie is hard to take, but I wanted to love it, but I couldn't. But you said something else there that really spawned something. But that I see what you're saying. The converted Catholicism, before I forget, you converted to Catholicism at what age?
31. I think it was like 2019. Okay.
Did you know Marshall converted to Catholicism?
I did. And so it's interesting about like what I was saying about Marx. Like I find Marx like demonic, basically. But a half truth still has a lot of truth to it. But I think I see Marx as someone like Louis Farrakhan, where Louis Farrakhan is actually pointing out a lot of real problems, and the solutions he offers, I think, are actually almost more destructive than the problems themselves. I think Marx, in a lot of ways, does that, like for different reasons. But like what Marx actually does is he creates a Derrida used this term in Spectres of Marx, and he said it favorably toward Marx, but a messianism without a messiah. That what Marx actually does is he reworks the template of like the messianic age, right? Of the Judeo-Christian vision of the last day. Yeah. And his utopia is this world, quote, from each according to his ability, each according to his need. And so there's something that's like, but again, we see the bloodshed and horror that Marx has left us with. I think the same thing could be true of fascism, or is true of fascism, right? Where what they're like, have you ever read the Futurist Manifesto?
I haven't read it, but I love them, and I use them in one of my questions.
But they were like authentically fascist, right? Like
I know, but I think they want to destroy all libraries in museums, and I go to a library every day. But I like that they thought up the idea. I don't want to say I want it destroyed. That's what art is. Art should fuck your shit up. Art is an anti-environment. It's like art is anything you can get away with. Yeah, so did they hurt people? I mean, I love the kids who throw Campbell's soup at the Mona Lisa because they know it's not going to hurt it. And they get in the newspaper and they get climate control protesters, so they get their message across. I know most people hate that.
So I think that attitude toward art, and maybe we can talk more in depth about this next time, but like I think the goal of art is to elevate the soul to God, and I think
of course I agree.
But so can I just say like the central issue I have with art as this destructive sort of Dionysian force is I think that's actually an indication of a decadent culture.
It is.
And so I think when a culture is in decay, the art actually is destructive to the culture and therefore deleterious to the soul of the individual that consumes it. And so I think someone like Iggy Pop is a good example where, like, if everyone behaved like Iggy Pop, if everyone behaved like Jack Kerouac, they would be a mess. Like
But I thought you
society.
liked Iggy.
I love Iggy as a craftsman, but I think that actually I
Right.
think that I think Dionysus is a demon. I don't think he's a
Yeah,
deity.
there you go. That's like Eric Andre. You know that comedian?
I think he's different. I'm an admirer of Eric.
That guy is a sick puppy. He went to Berkeley to become a jazz artist, and he's probably good. And he says, fuck this, jazz is boring. And so he does the stupidest talk show ever in the history of the world. And he gets on Larry King. How did he get on Larry King? Because he got popular. And then he's on Colbert or Jon Stewart selling a book. And I got the book at my library. It's like, what are you selling? Look, everything ends up in a book. You're supposed to be selling a stupid Netflix comedy special. He sells a book. So that proves you're in the right medium, Jacob, because books, do they still sell?
I think they can, but so you know who I would recommend to you, who I think is sort of like post Eric Andre humor, and it's interesting because like Eric Andre is very much of like the sort of establishment neoliberal left, and I think Eric Andre is very funny. And I think he's really interesting. And I think he's done a lot of good work. So this is no slight to Eric Andre, but there's a guy now who works on YouTube, and he's 17 years old. His name is Matan Evan, Matan space
Matt.
An.
Yep.
Evan. Okay, and he has a talk show now too, and he is absolutely hilarious. Like, you should see him because he does interviews with people, and you have to kind of know who these YouTube celebrities are to like really get why he's so funny. But he's an incredibly abrasive interviewer, but he's endlessly clever, like Eric Andre. But I feel like he's quicker on his feet than almost anybody. He's visionary. He's like Andy Kaufman or someone on this like crummy talk show he does on YouTube that's like it's so abrasive and he's so funny. And he's like so like, for example, this is I'll try and watch my language so you don't get deleted. But
look at Jacob, you don't even have to waste your time. I'll go watch him and give him 3 seconds, and then if it's good, I'll give him 10 seconds, and I'll give him more.
He's brilliant. You should really like
recommendation. I want to know about these kind of people, and because it is an amazing time we live in. I mean, we've gone 2.5 hours, an hour over my normal, and I really appreciate it. But here's the thing. My tolerance is like the industry standard. It's 10 seconds. So then if somebody tells me something who I trust, I try to give them a few seconds, and that's not fair, because that's like trying to absorb Tarkovsky in 3 seconds. You're going to miss it.
You know what? I'm going to email you. I think one of his funniest. So I actually think this is kind of
email me one of his best, and I will give it more than. How many minutes is he on? What's the?
Wait, so he's it's interesting because he. I think Rogan, for example, proves that it's not correct that all of our attention is short, right? I think one of the great things about Joe Rogan is it shows us that we can actually have sustained interest in long conversation. But so like.
Mine are 90 minutes, and people are like, what? I asked for 90 minutes up front, and now I'm doing part 2s and 3s. So, I know about long term, but people operate more in the Colbert. I'm going to give you 8 minutes,
So this, the thing I just sent you, he interviews this like Instagram influencer who actually seems like really sweet. And like, I don't think, like, I think he's actually kind of mean to her, but he's incredibly funny.
I'll check it out. No, I appreciate it. And always keep me posted, because I do come from the era. The reason I became an interviewer was because I'd watched the Mike Douglas show with my mom. I grew up on Johnny Carson, Merv Griffin, then Terry Gross and Dick Cavett, and all the great interviewers where there was longer. But even Terry Gross, she's short. she's got to be cut in by, now we're going to repeat the same line. I don't want to tell people, here's Jacob King, he is this, this, and this. I don't introduce anybody because their website will tell them. So if someone goes, well, who is this? I'll go, just go down and hit their website and learn who they are, or
Right.
Google. So I don't waste the time. I rather go into the dialogue, you know.
Sure. And like, to me, what is so, because Matan Evan is from a generation younger than me, you know, and I think what's also really interesting about him is almost all media before it's interesting because like YouTube cannibalizes television, you know, and I think people don't realize how different of a medium YouTube is than television. Like, we have independent film, but YouTube is independent television. And part of, I think, what's so interesting about YouTube is the media was dominated by this sort of neoliberal left-leaning view. And Matan Evan is, I think he toys with being more right-wing than he is a lot of times, right? Like he's Jewish, and like anytime someone says they're Jewish, he'll like spit and stuff. So he's like, he toys with like racist humor that like, but it's interesting because he's clearly, like, obviously he's not like anti-Jewish or anything, but he's clearly much more on the right, right? Like he'd be much more favorable to a Trump than a
you know who I'm going to look into him. What year were you born, Jacob?
I was born in 2002. No, I'm kidding.
Okay.
I was born in 1987. I'm 37, so I feel like an old man.
You were born in 87. No, because I was going to say, this is what, maybe you don't know, what Lenny Bruce learned from Lord Buckley. So Google Lord Buckley and study who he is. He influenced George Carlin, Jonathan Winters, Bob Dylan, and is the biggest influence on Lenny Bruce. Lord Buckley taught all these people how to turn joke telling into storytelling, and he subverted comedy from within. So there's people who come along and do that. So that's what I'm always interested in, the people who really change. I mean, that's what Frank Zappa changed, what rock and roll could do. It could make you think, and you could party and have a good time. Duchamp said, it's not just retinal. It's not just an eye experience. Joyce turned the reading experience into an ear experience, and Marshall kind of said what all the things you like about Marshall. You can articulate it. So, I mean, there's other people. I like Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. She proved we can be aware of what we're doing to Mother Nature in 62, and we're still not aware of it. But it, you know, you could say, hey, you don't want to put poison in your food.
Right.
You know, I go to my store and I can buy beets with poison, and they cost more than without poison. That to me is amazing. You know, you put pesticides on these, I'm going to charge you more. Okay, well, I'll take the non-pesticides ones. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not usually true. Most organic food costs more, and so people go, well, I can't afford organic food. It costs too much. So that's a fluke. So, you know.
Yeah, anyways. I mean, I do think I think you'll find something interesting in Matan Evan, because I think, first of all, culturally, like a lot of the stuff on YouTube or online is more right leaning. The stuff that's popular, which I think represents an interesting sea change. I mean, McLuhan talks about it too in Understanding Media, where he talks about this, like everything becomes inverted, where like the left now is the party of war. Do you know what I mean? Like, or the party against free speech, a lot of people say, you know, or the party of censorship, which is very interesting. And I'm not saying, you know, I think, you know, I wouldn't identify, my identification is with Christ, not with the left or the right. But it's interesting to see this like political inversion actually happening in real time, you know.
Well, that's an interesting interpretation, because I would say, you know, there's a lot to go on what you just said. We should close out now, but it's really, you know, the whole world of that is something I've studied deeply, because you brought up Farrakhan, and I could bring up LaRouche and all these other people in Coast to Coast. Do you ever listen to Coast to Coast?
No, LaRouche is such a weird figure. You know what? I want to tell you this about LaRouche before we go. Lyndon LaRouche is someone, I've read his Wikipedia article, as I recall. I've listened to lectures about him. And I cannot for the life. I've talked to someone who is a worker for the LaRouche movement, who is a friend of mine, and I cannot tell you for the life of me what he believes. I have no idea what he's saying.
Well, if you go to Bob Dobbs' interview with LaRouche, which is really rare, from LaRouche's jail cell, you'll get one of the best interviews. It's hard. Anyways, he's a complicated.
Did he deserve to go to jail? Did he go to jail for like a good reason?
Dude, yeah, it's a complicated thing. If I start saying things about LaRouche right now, people don't like that. You get you in trouble. It's just like Wyndham Lewis. There's certain names, people just saying the word Farrakhan. I understand that every human has has weaknesses and strengths.
Sure.
And so I'm out to find commonality in the human experience. And you can get in trouble just saying certain names, and like, so I think what we cover is more important in my realm is literature and cinema. But I don't want to stay away from everything because I think it's everything. But I think my whole sensibility now is worn out because I'm tired and I need to eat.
I get that. Yeah. So what in closing,
I don't want again, thank you, because it was really fun trying to close out an hour 10 minutes ago, and we just went on a really great rampage that was more spontaneous than following my script. So, I've got the next part starts at question 17. So I usually do 40 in 90 minutes. So we're doing good here, Jacob. We're getting deeper, knee deep in the swamp muck. That's what I want. I want to uncover the hidden psychic effects of conversation.
Oh yeah, well, hey, I'm grateful to be part of it. I'm enjoying it, and yeah, like it's interesting about Farrakhan, who again I'm not a fan of at all. I published on him. Like my only academic work I've ever published was on Farrakhan's adoption of Scientology. But it's interesting because I remember one of the things that I find really gross in our modern society is if you talk to someone you disagree with, it's like if I talk to a right winger or a left winger, but the left does this more than the right, where it's like I would be willing to talk to virtually anybody because I see everybody's a child of God. And even though someone like Farrakhan, with whom I strongly disagree with on a lot of points, like the fact that if you interview with someone or if you talk to someone, somehow that means you're endorsing everything they say or everything they believe in.
Built by association.
Which is before earlier Twitter culture actually had this thing where it's like if you were following people that were bad, that means that you agreed with them. Yeah. And they were bad. And you're bad too, which is, again, it's like a very, Gestapo kind of worldview, Stasi kind of worldview, rather. And
that's the question we covered in part 1. Do artists have moral obligations? So
they do, but they have a moral obligation also to listen to other people, and especially
I like that. But it is a pick and choose world. So, anyways, Jacob, what a pleasure. Thank you for your time and energy. You really taught me a lot. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Okay. Well, I look forward to it. Until the next time, Jerry. Yeah, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Jacob.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.